Those who came of age in the 70s, an era of second-wave feminism, radicalism, and individualism, benefited in numerous ways from the changes of that groovy decade and the 80s. When this group of beneficiaries entered the 90s, they were the first female generation in American history to have so many possibilities and opportunities. Feminism may have seemed obsolete or even unnecessary. Women were climbing the corporate ladder. Dr. Mae Jemison was the first black woman to go into space in 1992. Janet Reno became the first female attorneys general in 1993. Madeline Albright became the first female secretary of state in 1997. And Beverly Harvard was the first black woman police chief of Atlanta in 1994. As we'll explore, women reached new heights in various industries, embarked on new political battles, and looked good while doing it. But there were still fundamental differences and disagreements, plus a need for change, reflection, and consideration of the future. The decade was plagued by sexual assault and harassment that revealed the outcome of thousands of years of misogyny. Consider that in 1998, longtime rumors that Thomas Jefferson had a secret bloodline of children fathered by the enslaved Sally Hemmings were confirmed. The same year, Bill Clinton was impeached for lying about having an affair with Monica Lewinsky. In this episode of Lexual Does the 90s, we'll revisit the fun, complicated, dangerous, and eerily relevant landscape of womanhood in the 1990s. You might want to grab a snack and buckle up.
It's men are from Mars, women are from Venus.
Good.
However, there is no excuse for the continued proliferation of gangster porno rap.
Before we take a spicy look into 90s women's history, I'd like to thank all of the women before my generation who did all of the hard legwork. Those tenacious champions often fought the good fight trying to secure our rights, often without orgasm or sexual pleasure. Whether it was the stigma of the era or not knowing how to achieve sexual pleasure, salute to all of the women of the past who never had good sex, because if it was me, I'd try to keep my shit together, I would, but I'd be pretty pissed about it. They didn't have Beducated to guide them through masturbation, healthy communication practices, and a plethora of positions and techniques to enhance their sex lives. But you do. This Black Friday, instead of copying a gadget, invest in your sex life with a subscription to Beducated. There are over 100 courses by certified experts on everything you'd want to know about sexual pleasure. When you use my code Alexis60, you get 60% off the yearly pass. If you're a little shy, you can test out Beducated with a 24-hour free trial. And there's also a 2-week money-back guarantee. Use the link in my description box to take advantage of this Black Friday deal and upgrade your sex life today. From Tracy Chapman to Sheryl Crow to Whitney to Lil' Kim to the Spice Girls and Lauryn Hill, how does one capture the wide expanse of women's music in the 90s? While some names we've discussed in past episodes and related content, now it's time for a closer look. CeCe Winans, who began her solo career in 1995, and Yolanda Adams were tearing it up in contemporary gospel. Anita Baker, who had been successful for decades at this point, released her 4th platinum-selling album, Rhythm of Love, in 1994. Mary J. Blige, whose albums My Life and Share My World were released in the midst of drug and alcohol abuse and an abusive relationship, became an R&B icon. Though she never planned to grow up and become a singer, Toni Braxton's 1993 debut self-titled album went 8 times platinum, and her next album, Secrets, featured the mega hits You're Making Me High and Unbreak My Heart. The latter is one of the best-selling singles of all time and earned Tony Record of the Year, but You're Making Me High was better, personally. TLC, named for T-Boz, Lisa, and Chili, entered the scene in 1990 but shot to the top with their 1994 classic album, Crazy, Sexy, Cool. The album featured the hits Creep, Red Light Special, Digging on You, and Waterfalls, which discussed most prominently HIV/AIDS and won MTV's Music Video of the Year. TLC's 1999 album Fan Mail featured No Scrubs, written by Escape singer Kandi Burris. Fan Mail also had my favorite TLC song, I'm Good at Being Bad, and if you've never heard that, go look up the lyrics. Go look up the song right now, then come back to me. TLC embarked on the Fan Mail tour, and one of their opening acts was the newbie group Destiny's Child. By the end of the decade, TLC was the best-selling American girl group of all time. And both TLC and Toni Braxton would file for bankruptcy after predatory contracts with their record labels, and Left Eye's arson, which we discuss in I Love the 90s Scandals. Both Toni and TLC would rebound following the bankruptcies. Erykah Badu released the 3x platinum Baduism in 1997, making her one of the first female neo-soul artists to reach mainstream success when she won 2 Grammys. In 1999, after a modest debut success with No No No, Destiny's Child issued The Writings on the Wall, featuring the #1 hits Bills, Bills, Bills and Say My Name. Infamously, the music video for Say My Name showed that LaToya Luckett and Latavia Robertson were replaced by Farrah Franklin and Michelle Williams, leading to a lawsuit and negative press. Then there's Queen Janet, who was officially out of her brother's very big shadow. Janet's 1990 Rhythm Nation World Tour was the most successful debut tour in history, and she was just 24 years old. She then signed a $32 to $50 million deal with Virgin Records to become the highest paid contract artist, even beating out her brother. In May 1993, she dropped Janet, period. The sexy and confident album featuring That's the Way Love Goes, If, and Anytime, Anyplace sold 14 million copies and went 6 times platinum. The album's cover was shown more explicitly on Rolling Stone, featuring the hands of her secret husband. In the mid-90s, Janet was grappling with her mental health, and she divulged, "I was very, very sad, very down. I couldn't get up sometimes. There were times when I felt very hopeless and helpless, and I felt like walls were kind of closing in on me." The depression and anxiety she felt while being one of the biggest stars in the world led to one of my favorite albums of all time, The Velvet Rope. Everybody But Me loved Together Again, the pop anthem that went #1 and sold 6 million copies, but the real baddies were I Get Lonely, Go Deep, Got Till It's Gone, and my #1, Rope Burn. The album's BDSM, anti-homophobia, and pro-mental health messaging stood out in the late 90s in an era when women in rap music received renewed attention for their images and lyrics. There were braggadocious and sexually explicit hoes with attitude, Foxy Brown and Lil' Kim, who we discussed in this video on my channel. Queen Latifah entered the 90s riding the wave of 1989's All Hail the Queen, but when she dropped 1993's Black Rain featuring the hit single UNITY, her stock rose. Wrote reviewer Chris Willman, "Though guys take most of the heat here, her most powerful lyrics are lobbed against those young women who buy into the gangsta bitch mentality without knowing or caring about the price. Given that there's a female trio out right now called Hoes with Attitude, no one should suppose that she's speaking into a void." Added the LA Times, "Who you calling a bitch? Well, certainly not you, Miss Latifah, especially given your demonstration in this video of how well a solid right hook works as a short-term cure for sexism." In addition to Queen's Afrocentric imagery and messages of anti-misogyny, she challenged traditional beauty norms and expectations by being curvy. She also battled long-running rumors about her sexuality, especially after her killer performance as Cleo in Set It Off. In 1998, she became the first rapper to perform at the Super Bowl, though she was singing Heard It Through the Grapevine in a Motown tribute. Before the success of Eve and Lauryn Hill, Shantae Harris, aka DaBrat, was the first rapper to go platinum with her 1994 album Functified, featuring the hit song of the same name. She'd be featured in various songs of the era and famously dated Allen Iverson in the late 90s. Missy Elliot, who spent the early to mid-90s writing music for Jodeci, appearing on 7-year-old Raven Simone's That's What Little Girls Are Made Of, and collabing with Aaliyah, SWV, 702, Total, Melanie B, and Whitney Houston, blew up after 1997's Super Duper Fly, featuring the hit The Rain. 1999's The Real World also featured the hit Hot Boys. What about the music world outside of black women? Leeann Rimes went platinum at the age of 13 with her country song and album, Blue. While Canadian-born Celine Dion had multiple songs and albums in the 90s, it was her album Let's Talk About Love, featuring the Titanic theme song My Heart Will Go On, that cemented her status in the States. Shania Twain's country pop infusions and sexy image led to her best-selling album, The Woman in Me, getting snubbed by the Country Music Awards. But the follow-up, Come On Over, featuring, man, I I Feel Like a Woman became one of the best-selling albums of all time, and ended any talks of her not being country music royalty. Selena Quintanilla took the male-dominated Tejano genre by storm in the late 80s and brought it into a national spotlight in the early 90s, selling out stadiums and becoming a Grammy winner in 1994. After her tragic murder in 1995, her posthumous album Dreaming of You shot to the top of the Billboard 200. Gwen Stefani led rock band No Doubt to diamond status with Tragic Kingdom, bestowing us with Just a Girl and Don't Speak. There were the Spice Girls, the best-selling girl group of all time, who we come back to later in this episode, along with some angry and principled rockers who'd be overshadowed by girl power. Britney Spears became a megastar in the late 90s with Baby One More Time, a best-selling album that spawned the namesake single. It was ubiquitous and sold over 10 million copies. The music video, featuring the 16-year-old princess of pop bearing her midriff, caused some controversy. Britney quipped, "Me showing my belly? I'm from the South. You're stupid if you don't wear a sports bra when you go to dance class. You're gonna be sweating your butt off." In 1999, Christina Aguilera danced onto the scene with Genie in a Bottle, which was also criticized for being too provocative. It was the 7th best-selling single of the year, and the lyrics could be interpreted as pro-abstinence or pro-sex. But, sniffed former teen pop idol Debbie Gibson that year, "I was a kid who didn't grow up too fast. It terrifies me to hear an 18-year-old sing, 'Come on in, let me out,' with some conviction." The sexualized image of young female pop stars would only grow more contentious in the years to come. For tweens, the wholesome Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen began producing albums and movies in 1993 through their company Dual Star at the age of 6. They were multi-millionaires by the end of the decade. On the screen, Oprah, Rosie O'Donnell, Ricki Lake, and Jenny Jones would host shows that we discuss at length in the next episode. Whoopi Goldberg was box office gold, and numerous actresses would reach new heights of stardom and become it girls and multi-millionaires, including Drew Barrymore, Jennifer Aniston, and Gwyneth Paltrow. They were often paid more money and attention than black it girls like Halle Berry, Gabrielle Union, Nia Long, Tyra Banks, and Brandy, the latter of whom gets a deep dive over on my Patreon. I am really sorry if I didn't mention your fave, but if I had to list out every amazing thing that female entertainers did in the 90s, we would be here all damn day. So outside of music, TV, and film, women continue to be internationally recognized in sports. Apart from the Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan scandal, which you can check out in I Love the 90s True Crime, in the world of figure skating there were stars like Christy Yamaguchi and Michelle Kwan. In 1991, 19-year-old soccer player Mia Hamm was instrumental in the USA's championship victory in the inaugural FIFA Women's World Cup. She dominated the sport for the remainder of the 90s, but was also in a bunch of advertisements and product placements. Venus and Serena Williams were ranked among the best tennis players in the world by 1999, when at the US Open, the sisters won a doubles match, and Serena became the second black woman to win a Grand Slam singles competition after Althea Gibson back in 1957. The Women's National Basketball Association was established in 1996. It was the second women's league to exist after the short-lived Women's Basketball League of the 70s, but the first endorsed by the NBA. Before the WNBA was established, the best female basketball players went overseas when they were done with college. At the same time, the American Basketball League was set up as an alternative to the WNBA in 1996, but it only lasted 2 seasons, and it couldn't compete with the WNBA. When the WNBA was announced, Lisa Leslie, Cheryl Swoops, and Rebecca Lobo were on hand. By the way, Lisa Leslie guest starred in Moesha, Martin, and Sister Sister, and was known for being fashionable and attractive thanks to her appearance on red carpets and runways. When the WNBA was announced, some people were skeptical. Said a critic for Newsweek, "Commercially, the league is less a revolution than a brand extension. Wholly owned and run by the 29 teams of the NBA, it is something to busy the NBA's formidable marketing and merchandising machine while the men are on summer vacation." The inaugural WNBA draft was held on April 28, 1997, with teams in 8 cities, including the Charlotte Sting, the Los Angeles Sparks, and the Houston Comets. The new league slogan, "We Got Next," didn't immediately click for everybody, with critics turning up their noses at the non-standard English. Reported Deseret News, "Plenty of native English speakers don't get it. Yvette Angel, a guard, says she had to translate the term for her boss when it first hit TV in ads a few months ago. She was working in Orange County as a sales rep for college textbooks. where such phrases just aren't parsed, explicated, or otherwise deconstructed. The WNBA had a number of differences from the men's game, including a shorter game, a longer shot clock, and a smaller ball. The players reportedly had a hard time in the first season getting used to it. When the tickets went on sale for the first season of the WNBA games, marveled the spokesman review. The cheap seats are $5, the glamour seats $150. Everyone else who wants to attend a WNBA game will pay slightly more than they would for a big league baseball ticket. As a result, players weren't getting paid much, and some had to work separate jobs. Newsweek added, for the 30-game regular season, most players make between $13,000 and $62,500. A handful of players, including Rebecca Lobo of the New York Liberty and Nikki McCray of the Washington Mystics, have signed contracts that include money for endorsements and other personal services and are worth $200,000 or more. By comparison, the minimum salary for rookies in the NBA in the late 90s was $242,000. Attendance in the first season of the WNBA surpassed expectations, with an average of 9,000 attendees a game, sometimes including celebs like Rosie O'Donnell and Tyra Banks on the sidelines, and 1.4 million TV viewers. So the league grew, with the NBA spending $15 million on marketing, but slashing maximum salaries of the female players to $10,000 to $50,000 apiece. There were a total of 12 teams in 1999, when the league held its first All-Star game and players collectively bargained for a pay increase. The women were highly inspirational to a new generation of girls in sports, and prime entertainment for many a lesbian, with the editor of Out magazine, Sarah Petit, saying, "Next to the Ellen episode, this is the biggest news in the lesbian community all year long. If there's one thing lesbians are talking about, it's who's on the bench and who's on the floor." This interest meant money. Continued the Newsweek profile. A WNBA star like Swoops can have her own Nike shoe, her own basketball, sports bra, ankle support, action figure, videotape, and phone card, plus endorsement deals with Dr. Pepper and Discover Card. She also has a personal services contract with the WNBA for promotional appearances worth well more than her hardwood salary, a package worth about $1 million. Said her agent, men's endorsements still dwarf women's by about 10 to 1. But that's a lot better than 3 years ago, when it was 10 to 0. Women's money, power, and success are themes that are recurring in this episode. And trust me, we'll be back to plenty of media icons that you may think I've missed, including Riot Grrls and Madonna. But if one thing is clear from all the women we've discussed so far, they were a diverse medley of identities, brands, and values, but similarly buoyed, like the average woman, by expectations about their lifestyles and choices surrounding their sexuality and motherhood.
You said a man is not a necessity, a man is a luxury.
Like dessert. Yeah. A man is absolutely not necessity.
Did you mean that to sound mean and bitter?
Oh, not at all. I adore dessert. I love men. I think men are the coolest. But you don't really need them to live. My mom said to me, "You know, sweetheart, one day you should settle down and marry a rich man." And I said, "Mom, I am a rich man." You know? My experience with men is great because I pick them because I like them. I don't need them.
In 1991, the film Thelma and Louise was released in theaters, starring Susan Sarandon and Gina Davis. In the movie, Louise murders a man who attempted to rape Thelma, and the pair go on the run. The film was a huge critical and box office success, earning over $45 million worldwide. The movie's shocking ending, in which the pair choose to drive into the Grand Canyon rather than surrender to police, generated discourse about whether or not the film and the characters' choices were feminist. Many viewed the rogue film characters as feminist heroines, but wrote one critic for the LA Times, "How could Thelma, beaten and saved from a gratuitously shot rape attempt by a murder at close range, beg to pick up a strange hitchhiker 18 hours later because she likes the cut of his jeans? To write such perky bounce back doesn't suggest resilience, it suggests that no one's home emotionally. It's fine to have such characters, just don't be surprised if an audience resists seeing them as heroes." Arguments would also rage about whether or not the duo were lesbians, or if the film was queer allegory. While just a movie, the popularity of Thelma and Louise, along with other media of the era, reflected a real change in American women's desires and choices, and responses to them. The following year, 2020 did a sensationalized special on Northampton, Massachusetts, dubbed Lesbianville, USA by the press, because the city of roughly 30,000 was well known in the early 90s for being tolerant of lesbians.
What happens in a town where 1 out of 7 women is a lesbian?
You wonder why I would be attracted to men.
Correct.
Are they really that different? Don't make up your mind about women who love women until you see 2020, Friday.
Half of the downtown businesses were owned by women, and several were interviewed with their partners by Barbara Walters. One of the city's most famous residents was Leeann Newman, the author of Heather Has Two Mommies, the controversial children's book. There are lesbian wedding announcements in the local paper, a local weekly lesbian interview show on cable television called Out and About, and an annual lesbian summer festival, reported the Chicago Tribune in 1993. Part of the city's reputation was attributed to the progressive all-female Smith University and other small liberal arts colleges. Smith president Mary Maples Dunn issued a statement on lesbianism, saying, "Our problem is not with lesbianism on campus, but with exaggerated press attention to it." Life among the lesbians of Northampton didn't go without disagreements. For example, mused one business owner when explaining the community's differing ideologies. "Generational stuff, and some of that extends to identity and to politics. What do we want to call ourselves? Lesbian or queer? Do we want to work with men?" Across the country, lesbians were more prominent, and they had different concerns and beliefs. They organized into groups like the Lesbian Avengers in 1992, and in 1993 they organized the first Dyke March in Washington, D.C., before being spread elsewhere. Black lesbians had organized the United Lesbians of African Heritage in 1990 to promote their own visibility after feeling left out of the Black Gay Leadership Conference the year before. It would become Black Lesbians United. More American lesbians participated in pride events, ran newsletters and zines, and started bars, bookstores, and other businesses folded within larger communities like Northampton, and others in separatist environments on the fringes. In November 1993, a women's land or female separatist community named Camp Sister Spirit was founded in Ovid, Mississippi. On 120 acres of land purchased for $60,000, Brenda and Wanda Henson provided 180 beds for lesbians to enjoy on retreats. The town's residents complained that the retreat would bring more lesbians and overwhelm locals. According to the Hensons, the pair were harassed and threatened, and in 1994, there were multiple conflicting news reports that the couple's dog, or a random dog, was left dead on their property, either tied to the mailbox or found nearby. The couple informed the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, who reached out to the Justice Department. Attorney General Janet Reno then led an investigation into the town, sparking a lawsuit by residents that Reno's implementation of federal mediators wasn't legal because sexual orientation wasn't protected, like race, religion, and gender. Said a local preacher, "This community cannot define itself as white or male or female, or Baptist even. We acknowledge those necessary and right distinctions, but sexual preference is not a civil right. We're concerned that the Hensons will attract a larger, more active indigenous homosexual population like Northampton, Massachusetts. We don't want to be Lesbianville, USA, South." The Hensons were featured on Oprah and other TV shows, further pissing off residents of Ovid. Complained one woman to the New York Times, "I've lived here my whole life, and there are gay couples here and everyone knows it. The difference is they don't go around hugging and kissing and holding hands and going on TV to talk about it on Oprah like these people are doing. I don't want my children exposed to that." After a brief Senate hearing led by New York Representatives Gerard Nadler and Barney Frank to determine if the local law enforcement were doing their jobs, the media attention died down and the retreat continued to operate until 2011. Camp Sister Spirit was one of a handful of women's land retreats in communes across the country that had popped up since the 70s. The United Lesbians of African Heritage also hosted an annual women's retreat in Malibu called Sister Fest, beginning in 1991. Away from judgment, Black lesbians who dealt with potent homophobia from inside and outside the Black community could revel in each other's company. As for Black entertainers who were lesbian, they mostly lived in the closet, knowing what being out might do to their careers in the 90s.
Why do I have to be so ashamed? I mean, why can't I just say the truth? I mean, be who I am. I'm 35 years old. I'm so afraid to tell people. I mean, Susan, I'm gay.
This was less true for white female entertainers like Melissa Etheridge, Katie Lang, and Ellen DeGeneres, who came out and continued to enjoy success despite ongoing homophobia. But it was still pervasive overall. In much of popular media, lesbians were both a source of sexual objectification and anxiety. In the decades before, most women would have suppressed their desires to live a wretched life of pretend attraction. But there was a new normal.
Sure have a lot of books about being a lesbian.
Well, you know, you have to take a course. Otherwise, they don't let you do it.
There was Ross's lesbian ex-wife Carol in the extremely popular sitcom Friends. There's a recurring joke in flashbacks that Ross ignored red flags when dating Carol, like the fact that she played golf and lacrosse in college, and she cheats on him while married with her future partner Susan. It was important that in this super popular show, Ross and Carol end up having a son that they co-parent. Still, the precarious nature of being a lesbian in America, and especially one who's a mother or wants to be, was embodied by Bottoms vs. Bottoms in 1993. When a Virginia grandmother named Kay sued her daughter Sharon for custody of her son. Why? Because Sharon had a girlfriend named April. In addition to Sharon admitting she had struck her infant son twice and cursed around him and lived on welfare for a year, the court considered evidence of Sharon kissing April in front of the child. Per the advocate, Judge Buford Parsons forced Sharon to explain on the witness stand what lesbians do in bed. And then Parsons ruled that Sharon was an unfit mother because she and Wade had oral sex, which was illegal in Virginia at the time. Sharon was given 2 days a week of visitation with her son Tyler, but he wasn't allowed in Sharon's home and not allowed to have any contact with April, with whom he had already bonded. At this time, 1.5 million lesbians were believed to be mothers. When Sharon won an appeal that reversed Judge Parsons' decision, the Virginia Supreme Court then concluded the record shows a mother who, although devoted to her son, refuses to subordinate her own desires and priorities to the child's welfare before once again revoking her parental rights. The anxieties around lesbians, in addition to homophobia, were in part due to the faltering marriage and childbearing rates, which were on a downward trend for most of the decade. In 1990, the average age of women in the United States having their firstborn was 24 years, and it had been 22 just 30 years previously. On one hand, people didn't find lesbians suitable mothers and sought to erode their reproductive rights. On the other hand, people often looked at any woman who didn't want kids or marriage with disdain, and in turn accused them of being loose or a lesbian. So in the 90s, mothers took on a continued, though tweaked, importance in society and politics, idealized and catered to. Remark Clinton's communications advisor Don Bayer on the mother and the importance of her vote. V-chips, computers in classrooms, school uniforms, they're all about giving her control over the lives of her children. Enter the soccer mom. Claimed Kellyanne Fitzpatrick, soon to be Conway, in 1996, soccer moms of the 90s were the super moms of the 80s. Many have kicked off their high heels and replaced them with kids to watch their kids. If you're a soccer mom, the world, according to you, is seen through the needs of your children. For a brief time before the 1996 election, soccer moms were courted as a potent political group, as a good family-loving conservative. The choice to enroll your child into a luxury recreational sport was wrapped up in class, especially when you consider that some early politicos used the term waitress mom for blue-collar women in contrast. Warned a columnist after soccer moms were dubbed the 1996 word of the year. Don't be too eager to wear the label soccer mom just because your kid can smack a ball with his head. At its core, the term soccer mom serves as a catch-all for women who are completely pink, women who form opinions based on feelings instead of facts, women whose brains are warm, soft, fuzzy, brushed cotton flannel and synthetic mink. The term soccer mom should be as annoying to women as knee-highs with holes in the toes. Another columnist similarly warned conservatives to drop the term from their vocabulary, writing, "She appears ready to desert the grand old party and cast a ballot for Bill Clinton and the Democrats. What can Republicans do to win back the soccer mom? First of all, they can stop calling her soccer mom. It It would be hard to find a more unfortunate label for the hardworking American woman. Whatever they were called, mothers of all races were a source of debate throughout the decade, as immigration rates soared and demographics shifted. For the Clinton administration and many others, a woman's womb was inextricably tied to marriage. This was shown by the administration's passage of the 1996 Welfare Act. It stated, before tightening welfare eligibility for millions of single mothers, marriage is the foundation of a successful society. Marriage is an essential constitution of a successful society which promotes the interests of children. Promotion of responsible fatherhood and motherhood is integral to successful child rearing and well-being of children. The thing was, divorce and family breakups were most likely to happen to the poor, and marriage itself was going through changes. Women were getting married later, the average age being 24 in 1990 and 25 in 1997. In 1991, 2/3 of married American women with children worked outside of the home. And 2 years before, Felice Schwartz had wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review encouraging companies to divide their female workforce into two categories: those childless unmarried women who could ascend to more responsibilities, or those on the mommy track, destined to remain stagnant because she prioritized her children and home life. It's like they were almost daring women to make a choice between the two. By the mid-90s, there was an upward trend in news media depicting the plights of working mothers, a continuing trend that Susan Faludi pointed out as backlash to women in the 80s, insisting they could have it all. The negative aspects of marriage and divorce were explored in a multitude of media for different types of women. 1989's Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan was adapted into a movie in 1993. It was the first Hollywood film featuring a mostly Asian cast, and it explored the relationships and lives of Chinese American women and their mothers. For instance, the choice facing Asian women who marry outside of their race.
Shrimp, my favorite.
He should have taken only a small spoonful of the best dish until everyone had had a helping.
He has good appetite.
He shouldn't have bragged he was a fast learner. But the worst was when Rich criticized my mother's cooking, and he didn't even know what he had done. That was our cue to eat some and proclaim it the best she'd ever made.
You know, Linda, all this needs is a little soy sauce. So, how'd your mom react when you told her about the wedding?
It never came up.
By 2000, Asian women were almost twice as likely to marry a white person than Asian men. Another club movie was the 1996 film First Wives Club. It not only made over $181 million at the box office, but reboosted the careers of Bette Midler, Goldie Hawn, and Diane Keaton. While the film featured hijinks of middle-aged divorcees who had been wronged by their spouses, the dark nature of emotional, financial, and spousal abuse were explored, as well as suicide. It notably included a cameo of famed scorned first wife Ivanka Trump, who had been humiliated when Donald Trump left her for Marla Maples. Black women had their own playing field in media. In 1990, 9% of black women over 45 had never been married. By 2000, it was 12%. Their dating lives were humorously explored in the classic Living Single and in the 1992 book Waiting to Exhale by Terry McMillan, which was more serious while still being fun. Said one reader, "It strikes a chord because someone is finally speaking to us, college-educated, middle-class black women whose problems have nothing to do with getting our welfare checks." The film adaptation was a mega hit and was relevant to black women of the era. One character finds out her ex-husband is gay. Another is being strung along by her married lover. Perhaps most memorably, another's ex-husband leaves her for a white woman. By the end of the decade, there would be 268,000 black men married to white women versus 95,000 black women married to white men. In 1999, black infidelity in marriage was humorously depicted in The Best Man, which earned $34 million on a $9 million budget. My favorite, The Wood, also debuted the same year. All of the love stories involved, while messy, were black, and the wedding still happened in the end. But before you chose to get married, you had to date, right? In 1990, linguistics professor DaBrat published You Just Don't Understand: Women and Men in Conversation, exploring the communication problems between men and women. She theorized that women communicated to exchange emotions, and men wanted to do the opposite. Criticized fellow linguistics expert Alice Freed, the book simultaneously perpetuates negative stereotypes of women, excuses men their interactive failings, and distorts by omission the accumulated knowledge of our discipline. The book was popular in the mainstream, however, and hit the bestsellers list for 4 years. These types of books were popular throughout the decade. Barbara DeAngelis published Secrets About Men Every Woman Should Know in 1990, but it was her ex-husband John Gray's book who made the biggest splash. In 1992, he published Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, which became a national bestseller.
Okay, from now on, we're alternating Cindy Crawford's Aerobicize and Buns of Steel and reading one non-school book a week. My first book is Fit or Fat.
Mine, it's Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus.
Good.
Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus promoted gendered stereotypes about how women and men think differently about love and dating, declaring them fundamentally different. The timing of Men Are From Mars was perfect because it was published amidst the backdrop of the gender divide regarding the Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas national debate. The book was meant to reaffirm gender roles in a time when society was becoming more equitable. It was the best-selling nonfiction work of the decade and the third best-selling single book of the decade after 2 John Grisham books. Gray milked this corner of the market with an infomercial, sets of audio tapes and videotapes, weekend seminars, a CD-ROM, Mars and Venus vacations, and a one-man show. Time reported with fatigue in 1997 at yet another sequel. Mars and Venus on a Date will rehash some of the very same anecdotes and concepts, men are like blowtorches, women are like ovens, that can be found in Gray's other 6 books. Socialization and communication issues aside, the realities of dating were much more complex than man versus woman. Anxieties about HIV and AIDS permeated opinion editorials, experiences, and advice. More people were asking about sexual history, testing, and condoms with potential partners, especially after the story of Aileen Wuornos, who contracted HIV/AIDS from a bartender, became an activist, and died in 1992. In addition to sexual safety, there were other things to consider. A love guru in 1990 predicted that women are looking for nice, stable men who really want to spend time with them. Everyone is fighting for time in relationships. High power is not the commodity it was a few years ago. Of course, this wasn't true for everyone, and especially not during a recession. In the early 90s, on average, 41% of a family's income was generated by the wife, and in a quarter of such families, wives were the primary earners. For some men, this damaged the ego and could worsen emotional, physical, and financial abuse. And families with female breadwinners were 50% more likely to divorce. Some women actively chose to avoid being anything remotely considered a breadwinner. The gold digger, a woman who chose money and security over everything else, particularly the blonde prototype, was a recurring trope and object of media fodder in the 90s. You know the type. Debbie Jelinski, played by Joan Cusack in 1993's The Addams Family Values.
Don't I deserve love and jewelry?
Jennifer Tilly as Samantha Cole in Liar Liar.
Listen, you bastard. I want my money. I am not going to end up a 31-year-old divorcee on welfare because my scumbag attorney had a sudden attack of conscience.
The evil wannabe stepmother Meredith Blake in 1998's Parent Trap, played by Elaine Hendricks.
What is a hot young thing like that seeing a guy who walks around with his shirt tail hanging out and a cereal bowl full of chili? Then I realized there's about 1 million reasons why that girl's giggling. And all of them are sitting at the Napa Valley Community Bank.
Here's what's going on, buddy. The day we get married is the day I ship those brats off to Switzerland. Get the picture? It's me or them. Take your pick.
Them.
She was gonna ship them little brats right off to boarding school, honey. These caricatures were drawn from real-life women called gold diggers, who were treated with a fusion of awe, doubt and disdain. In the golden age of sex scandals, white women of a certain class and aesthetic were allowed to desire wealthy husbands, and were even celebrated for it. Take when Marla Maples was reported to be hooking up with the married mogul Donald Trump. In 1990, one enterprising reporter named Art Harris went down to Maples' hometown of Dalton, Georgia, to interview locals, many of whom were impressed with Maples' climb upward to an alleged billionaire, putting her on equal footing with another Dalton native making headlines, fast-moving news anchor Deborah Norville. "I'd love to be in Marla's shoes," said one divorced 28-year-old with 4 children. Added a 23-year-old teacher, "Marrying rich is the only way out of Dalton. I'd marry for money. I didn't do it the first time and it didn't work out. I was in love with a poor guy who wanted to run around. It doesn't matter to me if a woman earns it or marries it. I work now and I'm still broke." Marla was turned into a celebrity and even celebrated at her high school in 1991. She and Trump were married in 93 in front of 1,000 people from the political, art, celebrity, and sports worlds. Though, noted writer Julie Baumgold, there wasn't a wet eye in the place, and people openly betted on when the pair would divorce. In 1991, 23-year-old Anna Nicole Smith, born Vicki Lynn Hogan, met 86-year-old oil tycoon J. Howard Marshall while working at a Houston strip club. While being courted by the near billionaire, she starred in a plethora of Playboy material and became the Guess Jeans girl, with press at the time marveling that she weighed 140 pounds. While a sex symbol, Anna was a traditionalist who desired a financially secure mate, saying in a 1993 interview when asked if she was a feminist, "I don't understand that question." The interviewer asked, "Do you fight for women's rights?" To which Anna replied, "Whoever started that, I could kick them in the head. I believe in women staying home and watching the children while the husband's at work, the traditional way. I would have been home with my family right now, except for my husband." She was talking about the abusive ex she divorced in 1987. So when 26-year-old Anna married 89-year-old Marshall in 1994, married 90-year-old Marshall in 1994, she believed she would be given half of his estate when he died, based on a verbal agreement. When he died in 1995, Anna wasn't listed in the will, sparking an inheritance court case that lasted over a decade. Anna never saw a penny of the cash, but her choice to marry for money and lifestyle brought both infamy and fame. There was extensive ridicule, but also the lure of opportunity. Like Marla and the good folks of Dalton, in Anna's hometown of Mejia, a local store manager said they're proud of her around here. Everybody wants their hometown people to do good, no matter who they are or what they are. If he's got as much money as they say he had, she'll be filthy rich. Even if many aspired to, not all women could marry up, and many were more preoccupied with the concept of a Mr. Right. On TV shows like Love Connection and Singled Out, 90s dating culture was on full display.
I know I'm only 1 out of 50, but it's obvious. He'll ask all the right questions.
And I'll have all the right answers.
In 1995's The Rules, time-tested secrets for capturing the heart of Mr. Right, women were advised to not talk too much and to be feminine by not telling sarcastic jokes or being the loud, knee-slapping, hysterically funny girl. Women were especially told to play hard to get if they wanted to be able to hook their ultimate man, reflecting romance advice from more conservative decades in those gender role books, like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Wrote Elizabeth Gleick for Time, 3 decades after Helen Gurley Brown's classic Sex and the Single Girl offered women the heady advice that men are cheaper emotionally and a lot more fun by the dozen, all that solo flying seems to be less than thrilling. The Book of Rules was briefly influential and a steal at only $5.99 a copy. Of course, there was money to be made, like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Added Gleick, around the country, Rules girls are spontaneously forming themselves into support groups. They're paying $45 a pop to attend Rules seminars and forking over $250 an hour for phone consultations with authors Ellen Fine and Sherry Schneider, neither of whom is a credentialed anything. In 1999, the same year that Blind Date premiered, 23-year-old Wendy Shalit published a $24 self-help book named A Return to Modesty. She wrote that women's natural instinct to be pure for one man had been interrupted by a country at war with morals. She wrote that women had a reflex arising naturally to help a woman protect her hopes and guide their fulfillment. Specifically, this hope for one man. She added, "I see so many young women around me spending half of their time sleeping with all these men, and the other half telling me how heartbroken they are. I wonder who gave them the idea that this is what they had to do in the first place." The dynamics of the old-fashioned advice of the rules and a return to modesty versus the freewheeling serial dating was examined in Sex and the City Season 2 episode 20-something Girls versus 30-something Women, in which Carrie Bradshaw is followed around by a virginal aspiring author who both looks up to Carrie and sees her as emblematic of the problems in modern dating. And I'm so sad I could not find a clip of this to post for y'all. The same year of the book and that episode, reported Celine, a recent study found that only 40% of college freshmen believe if two people really like each other, it's all right for them to have sex, even if they've known each other for a very short time, down from 52% in 1987. And more than 1 in 4 18 to 24-year-olds call premarital sex always or almost always wrong, a 50% jump since 1972. If a wealthy and/or compatible husband was not available, and the rules didn't work to find Mr. Right, plenty of 90s women chose to stay single, and sometimes still had children. Both options were offensive to somebody somewhere. It is wrong. You shouldn't have a baby before you're ready, and you shouldn't have a baby when you're not married. You just have to stop it, said Bill Clinton in 1994. 2 years previously, when discussing the alleged causes of the Los Angeles riots, then Vice President Dan Quayle criticized the fictional character Murphy Brown, who opted to be a single mother.
It doesn't help matters when primetime TV has Murphy Brown, a character who supposedly epitomizes today's intelligent, highly paid professional woman, mocking the importance of fathers by bearing a child alone and calling it just another lifestyle choice.
The show creator, Diane English, said Quayle better make sure abortion remains safe and legal. The clip of Dan Quayle was integrated into the show's next season premiere.
Today, in a speech focusing on the American family, Vice President Dan Quayle had some strong comments on what he termed a poverty of values, citing Murphy Brown as an example. The speech, part of a West Coast campaign swing, was delivered in San Francisco to the Commonwealth Club of California.
Some might argue that attacking my status as a single mother was nothing more than a cynical bit of election year posturing. I prefer to give the Vice President the benefit of the doubt. These are difficult times for our country, and in searching for the causes of our social ills, we could choose to blame the media, or the Congress, or an administration that's been in power for 12 years, or we could blame me.
In 1990, the birth control implant Norplant was approved by the FDA. Wrote Donald Kimmelman 2 days later in the Philadelphia Inquirer. The main reason more black children are living in poverty is that the people having the most children are the ones least capable of supporting them. No one should be compelled to use Norplant, but there could be incentives to do so, before advising that the $600 to $1,000 procedure to install Norplant should be free. When called out and compared to David Duke, who we discuss in the next episode, Donald wrote, "I'm told that David Duke has said similar things to what we suggested in the editorial. Does this make me ashamed? No. It helps explain to me why David Duke, in his post-Klan incarnation, is getting so many votes. He talks publicly about stuff that the rest of us only reserve for our private conversations." A staff meeting at the newspaper was held when several black employees were outraged by the pieces. As for Norplant, Kansas Republican Kerry Patrick introduced a bill to pay $500 to women on welfare if they got the procedure. They would also get annual checkups and $50 a year as long as the contraceptive didn't budge. The initiative failed, but legislators in 12 states would similarly propose laws offering Norplant for chump change benefits. There's a reason these politicians specifically wanted long-term implants that needed to be surgically removed. According to the Guttmacher Institute in 1998, the contraceptive failure rates are higher for black and Hispanic women than for white women. White women average about 2.8 lifetime pregnancies per woman. Black and Hispanic women average about 5 pregnancies per woman. As discussed by Dorothy Roberts in Killing the Black Body, some judges exchanged jail sentencing for implanting the contraceptive, particularly for drug-addicted women. Complained an ACLU lawyer, "We would be delighted if this were a part of a package to improve reproductive health care for women and that there were no monetary incentives. But it's a bribe that pushes women into one choice instead of creating more choices. It crosses the line into unconstitutional coercion." In Baltimore, where Mayor Kurt Schmoke was dealing with a teen pregnancy rate 3 times higher than the rest of the country, Norplant was offered to teenagers at predominantly black schools. Baltimore had installed health clinics at its schools in the 80s, and these programs popped up elsewhere in LA and Chicago, again, predominantly at black schools. While Norplant was being pushed on a new generation of teens and women, there were awful side effects that had been suppressed. By 1996, 50,000 women filed lawsuits against the parent company Wyeth and doctors who prescribed it. In 1999, Wyeth issued an offer of $1,500 each to 36,000 women who hadn't been warned about the negative side effects of Norplant. While contraception was one thing, abortion was another. The abortion rate had peaked in 1981 when 3% of all women had terminated a pregnancy. But the rate then declined because of sex education, birth control access, and tightened abortion restrictions. Roe v. Wade hadn't stopped anti-choice activism or attempts by red states to ban the procedure. In 1992's Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the Supreme Court decided whether or not individual states could provide logistical hurdles to abortion without violating Roe. It all began a decade earlier when Pennsylvania added provisions to its law books requiring informed consent, spousal notice, and a 24-hour wait between appointment and abortion. Conservatives hoped that the case would lead to an overturning of Roe completely, which is what liberals feared, and there were several protests. On April 21st, Robert Shank brought the proclaimed remains of a black fetus he called Baby Tia to a Buffalo, New York anti-choice protest and displayed it for cameras. He wrote after being charged with violating a public health law, "I did the right thing. The arrest, the humiliation, the criticism from neighbors and friends were all worth it." Shank, a representative of Operation Rescue, claimed to have gotten the 23-week fetus from an unknown physician. Ultimately, the Supreme Court upheld Pennsylvania's provisions, giving states more power to interfere with abortion access. However, in addition to the liberal dissenters, Republican appointees Kennedy, O'Connor, and Souter refused to overturn Roe, instead choosing to respect precedent. So what remained was a hollow version of abortion access, not just impacting often poor, minority, rural, and abused women and teenagers, but it was poised to be dismantled over time. So after 1992, states imposed new restrictions on women seeking abortions, and the anti-abortion activists, who hadn't stopped working since 1972, ramped it up a notch. Norma McCorvey, the plaintiff Jane Roe in Roe v. Wade, was working at an abortion clinic in Texas when she began speaking with the national director of Operation Rescue, Flip Benham. He successfully convinced her to convert to evangelical Protestantism, and her baptism was filmed and aired on TV. Norma switched her pro-choice stance and came out in support of banning abortion. Norma, a lesbian who had been living with her partner since the 70s, renounced her sexuality as well, and she would later say both this and her conversion were for cold, hard cash. She got approximately $450,000 for her appearances and faux activism, which former handler Robert Shank explained made evangelical anti-abortion groups very rich. He said, "Her name and photo would command some of the largest windfalls of dollars for my group and many others, but the money we gave her was modest." By the way, Norma's life was absolutely crazy, and she was not a good person, including the fact that she considered lying about a group of black men raping her to get an abortion. And I encourage you to check out the glossary for this episode to learn more over on my Patreon. I also want you to stick a pin in the notion of lying about a group of black men committing rape. Between 1993 and 1998, 7 people would be killed by anti-choice terrorists and more would be injured, which we come back to in the next episode of this series. But the rise in activism and terrorism, as well as a restriction of abortion access, didn't mean abortions or birth control stopped being used. In addition to birth control and abortions, comprehensive sex ed in school helped, and this was crucial for teens. In the early 90s, experts were reporting that teen pregnancies were most linked with older, predatory men committing statutory rape. Teen pregnancy dropped by 4% in the 90s, and the pregnancy rate for black teens dropped by approximately 40% between 1990 and 2002. Neonaticide, or the killing of a newborn, became a closely related issue to teen pregnancy in the 90s. In 1991, a black 12-year-old orphan in Brownsville, Brooklyn, was impregnated by a 21-year-old cousin named Clarence Perry. The girl, who was in special education classes, had no idea she was pregnant, and nobody at her school knew. Hours after giving birth, she put the boy in a trash chute. The baby survived, and the event inspired Tupac Shakur to write 1991's Brenda's Got a Baby. 3 years later, according to the FBI, 207 children younger than a week old were murdered in 1994, a 92% jump from 1973. Most of the moms were young and poor, but there were cases involving the affluent too. In 1996, mid-upper-class teen couple Amy S. Grossberg and Brian C. Peterson killed their newborn baby in a Comfort Inn hotel in Newark, Delaware, after keeping the pregnancy a secret. They claimed it was stillborn, which was a lie. Both got short sentences and were out of jail by 2000. In 1997, 18-year-old Melissa Drexler gave birth to a baby at her high school prom in Forked River, New Jersey, while using the bathroom. The middle-class Catholic girl, who had kept the pregnancy secret, scooped the boy from the toilet, cut the umbilical cord, and threw him in the trash to rejoin her friends and date and eat salad. She served 3 years on a 15-year sentence for manslaughter. In a letter to the New York Times entitled "What Prom Mom Can Teach Us," the executive director of Planned Parenthood New Jersey wrote, "If she had called one of our Planned Parenthood affiliates, she could have received private and confidential counseling about her options, including encouragement to tell her parents. The counseling would have been respectful. The decision about what to do would have been left up to her, and hopefully her family. Coercion is not our style." Experts who conducted studies of teenagers committing neonaticide found that most were abused and/or had a fear of telling their parents about being pregnant. In addition to choices surrounding love, marriage, and baby carriages, many women of the 90s chose to have sex and express their sexuality. In 1992, fresh off the success of the 10th highest grossing film of the year, A League of Their Own, Madonna released the best-selling coffee table book of all time, Sex. The 128 pages of tasteful erotic art, poetry, essays, and statements featuring appearances by rapper Big Daddy Kane, Madonna's then-boyfriend Vanilla Ice, and supermodel Naomi Campbell sold 150,000 copies in its first day, at $50 a pop, or $111 in today's money. It eventually sold 1.5 million copies worldwide, while generating extremely negative press from across the political and social spectrum. A group of Baptists who used one of the printers for the book even threatened a boycott, while bookstore owners assured the public the minors wouldn't be able to buy the book or peruse its shrink-wrapped pages. Said the son of Penthouse founder Bob Guccione, "Madonna has overstayed her welcome. Her book, Sex, is a ripoff because it's not about sex, it's more about a hatred of it. The book is not erotic, it's a con job because instead of being flagrant pornography, it dresses itself up as great art." The book had been released in conjunction with Madonna's album Erotica, and the controversy and critique ate up the album's sales. Along with the book, Madge's public image, from the book's release party to her March 1994 appearance on David Letterman and her relationships with Tupac and Dennis Rodman, temporarily eroded her popularity. She toned it down in the mid-90s with 1994's Bedtime Stories, her 1996 performance in Evita, and her 1998 album Ray of Light. Madonna wasn't the only one to push boundaries about sex in the mainstream. In 1991, when a pregnant Demi Moore posed for Vanity Fair in the nude, people were forced to confront the nexus of motherhood and sexuality. Could moms be sexual creatures? Said to me, "I did feel glamorous, beautiful, and more free about my body. I don't know how much more family-oriented I could possibly have gotten." The photograph by Annie Leibovitz garnered massive discourse, with Carol A. Stable finding that within a year, there had been 95 television spots, 64 radio shows, 1,500 newspaper articles, and a dozen cartoons. One poll of 5,000 people in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution found 50% in favor of the photo and 50% disturbed by the photo. By the end of the 90s, such a photo shoot would be less shocking and less condemned, for reasons we'll come back to. But this type of 90s pop culture highlights that while women wanted what they wanted, the expectation of motherhood and the looming Madonna whore complex meant all of their choices were simultaneously scrutinized, applauded, monetized, exploited, and prototyped. And while women were celebrated and even rewarded for exploring their sexuality, the risk of violence and retribution was potent. Private topless photos of Marcia Clark, the prosecutor in the O.J. Simpson case, were sold to tabloids by her ex-husband and mother-in-law. The same happened to Tonya Harding. Pamela Anderson's decision to appear nude for Playboy in 1989 and 1990 helped boost her career with starring roles in Home Improvement and Baywatch, but it also made her a prime target. After marrying Motley Crue drummer Tommy Lee in 1995 after 4 days of knowing him, the couple recorded a vacation that featured a normal married activity: sex. The tape was stolen and distributed by the Internet Entertainment Group, with little public outcry or outrage. Pamela sued, but dropped the suit because she was pregnant and didn't want the ongoing stress of a litigation battle. So the company republished the video for bigger profits, and the invasive sex tape industry would flourish. While shameful, revenge porn was par for the course. The first law criminalizing stalking went into effect in California in 1991. The influential anti-stalking measure complemented the 1994 Violence Against Women Act. The year it was established that domestic violence costs the country $5 to $10 billion a year in healthcare and justice system fees. Joe Biden was a staunch supporter and early drafter of the VAWA, which gave $1.6 billion for investigating crimes against women, allowed civil lawsuits against perpetrators, and established a federal rape shield law to protect the sexual histories of victims in court. While it was momentous federal law, getting police and local judges, as well as communities and individuals, to take the legislation seriously was a challenge. For instance, Lorena Bobbitt's assertions in 1993 that her husband had raped her before she sliced his penis off were futile. At the same time, Lorena's defense that she was a battered woman who suffered a psychotic break held up in court. You can learn more about that case in Lexual Does the 90s True Crime. After the implementation of VAWA within the 1994 crime bill, domestic violence rate fell from 10 in 1,000 women to 4 in 1,000, though experts were careful to point out that this was reported violence. The number of women killed by a partner dropped 26% between 1993 and 2001, but the number of men killed by their female partners dropped by 45% because they were going to jail for abuse or other crimes instead of being left out to terrorize their victims into self-defense. Another law passed to address violence against women was taken up by a survivor. In 1990, Pam Lyncher and her husband were the victims of a vicious assault by a convicted rapist and child molester named William David Kelly, who had intended to rape Pam. The experience and a 1995 notification that Kelly was going to be released early from his 20-year sentence for the crime influenced Pam into action. Her group, Justice for All, along with bipartisan support, created the Sexual Offender Tracking and Identification Bill, which required sex offenders to be tracked and kept in a federal database, along with notifying authorities when they move. The bill was passed into law after Pam and her daughters were killed in the TWA plane crash in 1996. Violence within the home and intruders weren't the only cause for concern. With so many women working outside of the home, sexual harassment in the workplace was a more pertinent issue than ever before. The Civil Rights Act of 1991 added an amendment that improved federal civil rights laws and the ability for victims of employment discrimination to sue, though this would be another point of contention for tort reform discourse, which we touched on in I Love the 90s Food History. Costly sexual harassment suits became the boogeyman of the business world. In September 1990, Boston Herald reporter Lisa Olson was sexually harassed by at least 3 members of the New England Patriots while trying to conduct a locker room interview. This included when tight end Zeke Mowat intentionally walked naked in front of her, teammates egging him on. When Lisa reported the incidents to management, they didn't reprimand the players. Ultimately, after the issue began circulating, the NFL commissioned a report completed by a Harvard law professor who found team management liable. Mowat was fined $12,500 by the NFL, 2 other teammates were fined $5,000 apiece, and the team was fined $50,000. Olson claimed to have received death threats, and she rejected an offer to pose in Playboy. The sexual harassment issue was put under a more prominent national microscope in October 1991 during the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, which we discussed back in episode 3. That sexual harassment and the hearings rippled into other events. On October 16, 1991, George Hennard went to Lubby's cafeteria in Killeen, Texas, and murdered 23 people and injured 27 others. Most of the victims, women. Recall the witness who saw Hennard the day before the massacre? When an interview with Anita Hill came on, he just went off. He started screaming, "You bitch, you bastards open the door for all the women." Anita's steadfast and brave testimony had inspired action, like African American women in defense of ourselves, and gender discourse both inside the Black community and outside of it. While white supporters under the banner of Women for Clarence Thomas championed the Bush appointee, other white women, including uncomfortable Republicans, urged the Senate to deny his confirmation. But as we all know, he ended up being confirmed, and the next year, in 1992, 4 women were elected to the Senate, inspiring observers to champion the Year of the Woman. The new members of the Senate were Dianne Feinstein, Patty Murray, Barbara Boxer, and Carol Moseley Braun, the first Black woman elected to the Senate. Said Barbara Mikulski, who won her re-election to join the incumbents, "Calling 1992 the Year of the Woman makes it sound like the year of the caribou or the year of the asparagus. We're not a fad, a fancy, or a year. No. Women in power were here to stay." They were also growing more comfortable with exposing sexual harassment and assault. In 1996, brokerage firm Barney Smith was sued by approximately 2,000 female employees in what was called the Boom Boom Room suit, so named because of the basement room where rowdy brokers held their Wolf of Wall Street style parties. Reported the Washington Post. 26 named female plaintiffs who work or worked in Smith Barney offices across the country alleged that they were systematically excluded from lucrative broker jobs amid a male-dominated fraternity house atmosphere in which women were harassed, intimidated. The women won $150 million in damages. Another segment of women who were grappling with misogyny and sexual harassment were those in the military, where over 200,000 new combat positions would be open for them by the end of the decade. In May 1990, the National Organization of Women picketed the Annapolis Naval Academy after a first-year student named Gwen Dreyer was handcuffed to a urinal. Female students rejected the protest, saying it was a routine part of fun and games hazing that everybody participated in. In the aftermath, the Academy found rampant sexism on campus and created a committee on women's issues. In July 1991, Congress lifted a ban on women flying combat aircraft, but it wasn't enough. The following year, a 19-year-old Navy pilot named Rosemary Mariner, who served as the first female head of a Navy squadron, noted, "If the institution says you're not good enough to fight or doesn't want you to, it's natural for people to think you're inferior. Until you remove all the combat restrictions on women, you're going to continue to have this problem." What was this problem she was referring to? The revelation about what went down in September 1991 at a 35-year-old annual convention for retired and on-duty aviators named Tailhook.
I don't know how to describe it other than if you can picture as many men as possible surrounding you and trying to touch you.
The men in question are U.S. Navy pilots. They were in town last September for the annual Tailhook convention held at the Las Vegas Hilton. What happened on the 3rd floor of the hotel one evening during a cocktail party is now under investigation. Naval officers are accused of sexual criminal offenses by 2 female tourists staying at the hotel. The women say shortly after checking in, they were invited to a party. But soon as they got off the elevator, they realized they'd been set up.
Though it was a private event, the military paid $190,000 U.S. tax dollars to fly 1,500 active officers to Las Vegas for the weekend of fun, joining 2,500 other attendees. There, on a 3rd floor corridor of the Las Vegas Hilton, at least 83 to 90 women were sexually assaulted and harassed by Marines and sailors, who were also streaking, mooning, and enticing passerby into belly shots. The men waited for women to walk down the hall, dubbed the Gauntlet, and according to the LA Times, a scout would shout out, "Clear deck," and when she tried to make her way through, the walls would close in with a flurry of grabbing, pinching, and groping of her breasts, buttocks, and legs. Some women had part of their clothing ripped off. Members of the El Toro Marine Corps Air Station were singled out for having a dildo and mural of a bull rhinoceros in their room, where they tried to force 5 women to drink a mixture of rum, Kahula, milk, ice cream, and ice called Rhino Spunk. One woman, a 29-year-old named Paula Coughlin, managed to bite one of her attackers in the third-floor corridor when he attempted to grab her crotch. She immediately complained to her superior, a top Navy official. Paula was told, "That's what you get for going to a hotel party with a bunch of drunk aviators." A formal investigation began on October 11th after the top officials spent weeks trying to clean house. The eventual Department of Defense report said that what happened at the convention wasn't new, and that the 1991 weekend was more tame than past ones. Most of the assaulted women refused to press charges or go public because of the potential for retribution within their military careers. And as the DoD report claimed, some women actively participated in gauntlet activities. Anti-feminist Jack Kamer wrote a scathing review of the affair for Reason, calling the Navy's pivot from cover-up to prioritizing stamping out sexual harassment as having been commandeered by activists succumbed to the Stockholm Syndrome. While Paula Coughlin and 8 other women sued the Tailhook Association and the Hilton, Senate hearings were held over the fates of the male perpetrators who had been identified. Most got slaps on the wrist. Paula settled for $400,000 with Tailhook and a further $5 million from Hilton. Male participants called themselves survivors of the Tailhook witch hunt. The treatment of women in traditionally male spaces such as the military was only becoming a more pertinent issue. A lawsuit was launched by Shannon Faulkner in 1993, who wanted to attend the Citadel all-male military school in South Carolina. After a nearly 3-year fight, she was inducted as the first female student in August 1995. Out of the nearly 3,000 students, only 5 male cadets were allowed to speak to her. Any other risked punishment. She, along with 30 male students, didn't survive Hell Week, and she left, citing death threats to her family and stress. 4 other women would attempt to train at the Citadel before the end of the decade, and 2 would face extreme harassment and hazing that led to lawsuit payouts. According to a 1995 survey, 4% of all female soldiers reported being the victim of sexual assault. The next year, 12 drill instructors at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland were charged with various sex crimes. Reported Newsweek, the drill instructor is part boss, part teacher, part parent. He or she can ruin your military career. As a result, male drill instructors with a yin to coerce sex from female re-emits are in a perfect position to do so. The original complaint was by a 17-year-old Jessica Bleckley, who was threatened by a married drill sergeant when she turned him down for sex. She was also raped by a sergeant named Delmar G. Simpson, who committed at least 18 rapes of cadets between 1995 and 1996. The burden of proof against him and 3 others was so staggering that they were discharged and sent to prison. Simpson got 25 years with parole eligibility after 8 years, and from what I was able to ascertain was released before 2011 with absolutely 0 news coverage, and now possibly works as a cook at Caesar's Palace in Vegas. As a result of the Aberdeen scandal, the Army created a hotline in 1996 to deal with sexual assault, and it received 4,000 calls in the first week alone, leading to 500 separate investigations.
Now, I'm telling you, soldiers, that if she says no, that means no. But no, we're not going to stop there. I'm going to ask you to get a yes, like a responsible adult. Get a yes.
Less than a week after Aberdeen broke, 3 other drill sergeants in Missouri at Fort Leonard Wood were also charged with sex crimes. Allegations and confirmations of sexual harassment or assault were also in the political world, where there were new standards for decency from elected officials. The offenses ran the political gamut. Strom Thurmond, the racist and longest-running senator with a secret biracial daughter, was known to fondle women in elevators. Washington Democrat Brock Adams abandoned his post as senator in 1993 when it was revealed that he had harassed or raped at least 8 women since the 1970s, including the daughter of a friend. A hairdresser's 1975 rape allegations about Daniel K. Inouye, a Democrat from Hawaii, were joined by at least 9 other allegations of sexual harassment that were suppressed. In March 1991, Senator Ted Kennedy went out to a bar in Palm Beach with his son Patrick and his nephew William Kennedy Smith. Patrick and William brought back women to the Kennedy mansion, and one of the women, Patricia Bowman, was allegedly raped by William. Within hours, she immediately reported the incident to police and received a rape kit. A trial date was set for December. Fast forward to September 1991, just a few months later. Ted Kennedy was silent as a church mouse at the Senate confirmation hearings for Clarence Thomas, feeling unable to speak about sexual harassment without being labeled a hypocrite, only finding the capacity to speak about Thomas the day before the confirmation. 3 other women who had been sexually assaulted by William Kennedy Smith in the 80s were brought to testify at the trial, which dominated CNN's airwaves for 3 weeks and was a national spectacle that would only be surpassed by the O.J. Simpson circus. But according to Paul Schwartzman, prosecutors were set to call to the stand 3 more women, a doctor, a law student, and a medical student, willing to testify that he assaulted them between 1983 and 1988. The judge barred their testimony. For the duration of the trial, Patricia was anonymous. When she went public, she gave her reasons. The defense attorney was saying I was nuts for using my name on TV. I felt the need to get out there and urge victims to prosecute because it's part of the healing process, wrote Dominic Dunn, her interviewer. During Bowman's time on the stand, a woman reporter sitting next to me had whispered in my ear, if I were ever raped, I'd never report it. The jury returned a not guilty verdict in less than 78 minutes. Patricia said, it's the acquittal that money can buy. They had 9 months to come up with their story. He had all kinds of resources, which they've already testified that they used. He had all this material with which to concoct a story. And that's what he did. He concocted a story. In Paula Jones's ongoing sexual harassment trial against Bill Clinton, she similarly felt squeezed out of due process by his power and money. She also didn't have much feminist support. In '98, when Bill Clinton finally admitted to beginning an affair with 22-year-old intern Monica Lewinsky back in '95, which gets talked about extensively in Oral Sex: A History and will be contextualized in future content in this series, it was readily excused by many feminists because Lewinsky consented. Even if there was discomfort around the age difference, very few feminists of note, or Democrats period, were willing to examine the power dynamics at play. They had been chatty when it came to Bob Packwood and Clarence Thomas, but quite mum on Clinton. Instead, they latched on to the candidate who would most likely keep the fraught rights they had just earned less than 2 decades prior intact. Wrote Jania Belafonte, conservatives have an easy explanation for these forgiving attitudes towards the president's private treatment of women. They say Clinton-loving feminists, as if following the How to Catch a Man rules manual, have chosen to overlook the faults of a man who has been their best provider. Ideals be damned for the president who vetoed the ban on partial birth abortions. Most Americans in general didn't blink at the presidential affair's age gap. It was a country where septuagenarian Hugh Hefner dated 18 to 20-somethings, and not even statutory rape was taken seriously, let alone the concept of power imbalances and grooming. In Belmore, New York, 39-year-old Joey Buttafuoco got 6 months for the statutory rape of 16-year-old Amy Fisher. When she was 18, Fisher shot and nearly killed his wife, Mary Jo, allegedly after multiple instances of Buttafuoco suggesting someone should murder her. The ordeal would inspire Alan Ball when writing the 1999 movie American Beauty. Amy, dubbed the Long Island Lolita by the press, got 5 to 10 years and served 7, while Buttafuoco was out in 4 months, and both were minor celebrities for the rest of the 90s. On college campuses, the topic of date rape came into focus when Katie Royf wrote an article in the New York Times. Whether or not 1 in 4 college women has been raped then is a matter of opinion, not a matter of mathematical fact. Today's definition has stretched beyond bruises and knives, threats of death or violence, to include emotional pressure and the influence of alcohol. The lines between rape and sex begin to blur. The 1 in 4 statistic on those purple posters is measuring something elusive. It is measuring her word against his in a realm where words barely exist, wrote Royf, whose essay was turned into the 1993 book The Morning After: Sex, Fear, and Feminism on Campus. Royf's book, while defended by feminists like Camille Paglia, was derided by other feminists for victim blaming. Royf argued that the circumstances surrounding campus rapes were often murky and bogged down by consensual consumption of alcohol and drugs. Royf also insisted that feminists were spinning women into wide-eyed innocence, perpetually offended by sexual innuendo, feeding into larger arguments about the proliferation of politically correct culture. The founder of the Rape Prevention Program at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Gillian Greensight, wrote that the potency of rape was being undermined by the growing tendency of some feminists to label all heterosexual miscommunication and insensitivity as acquaintance rape. Meanwhile, said Paglia, blaming the victim makes perfect sense if the victim has behaved stupidly. So a little while ago, I told you to stick a pin in the idea of black men being accused of rape by white women. The Morning After's lampooning of the concept of rape culture was published in the same year that the prosecutor of the falsely incarcerated Central Park Five, Linda Fairstein, published Sexual Violence: Our War Against Rape. On one hand, the victim, Trisha Melly, had actually been raped. On the other hand, a corrupt police department and prosecutor pinned the crime on innocent black teenagers. For this reason alone, allegations of rape that crossed the color line would always solicit extra scrutiny and support from either side, especially in the racially tense 90s. It had been easy for the white mainstream American public to believe that the Central Park Five had raped Trisha in 1989, though there was no evidence and the confessions had been coerced, because the racial dynamics of the case were familiar, even welcome. This was true then, and it's true now, but that's a video for another day. In the 90s, even though the hollow slogan "Believe all women" was not invented yet, a white woman's word in the middle of interracial allegations often held more weight than anyone else's. But what happened when the circumstances were inverted? Would Donald Trump be there to issue an advertisement calling for a return of the death penalty no matter the race of the victim? In March 1990, a black Jamaican student at the largest Roman Catholic university in the country, St. John's in New York, accompanied a classmate back to his home. It was an off-campus residence nicknamed Trump Palace. It was at Trump Palace that the 21-year-old woman was plied with alcohol until semi-conscious and sexually assaulted and orally sodomized by 7 white students. The victim, who was 5'2" and 100 pounds, came forward about the rape 15 days later. 6 students were charged with sexual abuse and sodomy, and 5 of them were members of the lacrosse team. While the ensuing trial would make headlines, mostly around New York, there was no call for a return of the death penalty from Donald Trump or anybody else. According to the victim's testimony, quoted by the New York Times, she said she heard the men debating what to do with her. One asked, "What if she talks?" Another replied, "So what? Remember Tawana Brawley? Nobody believed her. Nobody will believe this one." One perpetrator, a 21-year-old named Joseph Riley, pleaded out before the trial and took a reduced sexual abuse charge in exchange for testifying against his fellow rapists. A 22-year-old student named Thomas Dean testified for the prosecution, earning a light sentence for admitting to fondling the victim's breast and watching the assault happen. Despite these witnesses, the 3 men who were brought to trial were acquitted of all charges. The last 3 took plea deals, including Michael Calandrio, the man who brought the victim to the house under false pretenses. Reported the Times, he interrupted his trial yesterday to plead guilty to sharply reduced charges, then admitted that he had done virtually everything he had been originally accused of. He got 3 years probation and 500 hours of community service and is now a physical therapist. And there's his information right there on the screen. On campus, profiles of students showed little sympathy for the victim. Wrote the New York Times, a 22-year-old black student called the attack sick, but like many other students, he also faulted the victim. "I felt she shouldn't have been where she was. It was an all-guy house. She messed up." He professed not to be shocked or even surprised by the nature of the incident. "It's seeable," he asserted knowingly. Anyone can picture that happening. This permissive and dismissive culture impacted women of all colors, but there was an added layer of misogynoir for black women who, alcohol or no alcohol, were usually blamed for any harm that came to them. Between 1994 and 1998, 4.2 of every 1,000 rape victims were black girls over the age of 12. White girls over the age of 12 were 4.3 of every 1,000 victims, in part reflecting their ability to come forward. But between 1999 and 2004, while the white victim rate dropped to 3.1, The black victim rate dropped to 4.1 per 1,000 victims. When R. Kelly was exposed for marrying a teenage Aaliyah in Vibe magazine, 2 readers wrote in saying, "Aaliyah is mature beyond her years," and "please reserve the title teenage superstar for artists who have proved their staying power, and not a snot-nosed 15-year-old whose only claims to fame are a couple of hits and the fact she married a 27-year-old R. Kelly." And remember Desiree Washington, the pageant contestant who was raped by Mike Tyson? When Tyson was released from prison in 1995, still feigning innocence, Al Sharpton and other leaders planned a homecoming for the beleaguered boxer in New York, rumored to be a parade. Said Al Sharpton, who as you remember spent a bunch of energy fighting for Tawana Brawley, who was ultimately found to be lying, "We have to be careful not to send a signal that we endorse the abuse of women, but we also cannot send a message that people in our community cannot be redeemed and given a second chance." Added a Harlem minister and organizer, "If he had been white, he would have never served a day on this crime." Well, at least he admitted a crime had taken place, right? Concerned citizens and feminists organized into a coalition to stop the event, which ended up being a candlelight vigil where Tyson could come and apologize. Al Sharpton went on to compare Tyson to Malcolm X, saying, "A convicted pimp fresh out of jail named Malcolm X came here and made good on a second chance." Tyson eventually declined attending the event. While the rape culture of the 90s was more evident than ever, surprise, surprise, it didn't unite feminists or even convert most American women to the cause. Hey, are you still here? Are you enjoying this trip through the 1990s? Are you thinking about how much information this is and thinking about how long it took me to research, write, and produce it? Make sure you show support by subscribing on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you get access to sources and early access to new content. For $3 a month, you get study guides, glossaries, and word puzzles for each feature-length episode of the series. For $5 a month, you get all of that, plus the exclusive video series, Deep Cuts, where nostalgia, pop culture, and history collide. For $10 a month, you get listed in the credits of I Love the 90s episodes. Patrons at the $25 through $50 tier get limited edition merch and listed in the credits of every video. Check the link in my description box for more information. And of course, if you don't want monthly subscriptions, trust me, I understand, but you still want to help me produce these, you can send a one-time tip on PayPal or purchase downloadable glossaries and study guides from my website. A free way to help this series grow is by liking, commenting, and sharing. Now, back to the history. As we explored in the 70s and 80s, new technology would alter the world of sex work, the demographics of who was participating, and how they were viewed. To be clear, there was still a large group of women who operated from truck stops, street corners, and elsewhere. But there were new avenues for those who fit certain class, race, and social quotas. Sex workers who had moved from the streets and the classifieds to fax machines, cell phones, and VHS porn in the 80s now had the internet, strip clubs, groupie industries in proximity to professional sports, and other new and accessible ways to make money. As discussed in A Black History of Stripper Culture, strip clubs catering to a black clientele grew more numerous during the decade, in conjunction with the higher-paying sports industry. An abundance of new teams, stadiums, and arenas meant more athletes, entourages, and nightlife. Destigmatized visits to strip clubs by rowdy college boys, businessmen, and athletes meant more women, especially those with few other options for healthcare, childcare, housing, or college, entering the strip club in floss and pleasers. For some, it was purely about dancing for money, and for others, who 10 to 20 years previously would have been unsafe on a street corner, the club was a space to meet new clients or even do full-service sex work from VIP rooms. Clubs, already extracting house fees, sometimes engaged in pimping. The anonymity of the 90s meant many women could strip part-time, traveling out of state for secret labor where nobody knew them, or full-time before leaving with little evidence that they ever did it. This was even more true with phone sex operators. The phone sex industry that had begun to blossom in the late 80s continued to be popular into the 90s, with the establishment of call centers and more frequent late-night TV ads.
Director Spike Lee got in your face. Now he's gonna get in your ear.
You've just reached the hottest live talk line around.
The industry was portrayed in the 1996 Spike Lee directed film Girl 6, written by Suzanne Lori Parks. Over on the internet, the first live stream to garner regular visitors featured a coffee pot. The second was Jenny Cam, a project by 19-year-old Jennifer Ringley, who began streaming her life from her dorm room at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania in 1996. Ringley grew up as a nudist, and her carefree exhibition was a perfect fit for the net. In the primitive live stream, images straight from her home were replaced every 15 seconds, and nosy voyeurs could watch her study, complete chores, hang out with friends, striptease, masturbate, or have sex. At its peak, Jenny Cam was attracting 4 million views a day, and she began charging for access in 1997. About 5,500 people pay $15 each year to be Jenny Cam subscribers who can receive updated images every 3 minutes. It costs more than $3,000 to run the site each month, reported Barbara Hagenbaugh in 1997. When she was compared to the 1998 film The Truman Show, Jenny said, "It seems to be the same type of people watching. Not perverts, just curious people. I predict Trumania will spread faster than Jurassic Fever." While Jennifer was not explicitly a sex worker, her use of the internet to make money from voyeurs hoping to catch her getting into the shower or bringing home a boyfriend for sex on live stream was early pioneering for later online sex services. However, Jenny wouldn't reap the financial rewards that future cam girls did, and it would be noted in 2000 that she was $20,000 in debt. When Jenny Cam shut down on New Year's Eve 2003, it had been up for 7 years and 8 months. A much more lucrative female pioneer of the internet sex trade was Danny Ash. In 1995, she was a decade-old veteran in stripping and porn when she and her husband created Danny.com, or Danny's Hard Drive, featuring mostly softcore images using $8,000 worth of computer equipment. The website was so immediately popular that it crashed her ISP server. By 2001, the website was earning $30 million a year, thanks to 29,000 users paying $29 a month. And Danny's Hard Drive was just one of several subscription model adult websites that cropped up at the end of the 90s, and the lucrative industry was obvious to everyone involved. Porn itself was in a new era of high production values, expensive set design or on-location getaways, and strict yet lucrative contracts for the most prominent performers. The average porn star can make $100,000 a year if she was white and thin and regularly working, while big stars could make millions.
Today's show features the hottest performer in adult entertainment today. Please welcome Jenna Jemison.
Take Jenna Jemison, who was the most famous porn star of the era. After stripping in the early 90s, she got into the XXX business to hit back at a cheating ex. Eventually, she signed a contract with Wicked in 1994. She got paid $6,000 a month to perform in 8 to 10 films a year, doing 3 or 4 scenes in each. Jenna, who mostly did lesbian scenes, but never anal, double penetration, or interracial scenes, supplemented this income with stripping. People today might not remember, but in those times, a white porn star who did interracial risked her marketability, and the same for other taboo acts. Forbes explained how Jenna made her money. At her peak, she got $5,000 a show, typically did 4 shows a night, and made extra cash posing for Polaroids with panting patrons, $40 per, selling her latest movie, $50, and gouging gawkers for tips. She claims she often made $50,000 a week. Jenna also had mainstream appearances in similar raunchy avenues like shock radio and wrestling, the latter of which was in the Attitude Era.
Hey, I'm Jenna Jemison, and you know, I've seen some really extreme things in my lifetime, but nothing, I mean nothing, compares to ECW.
At the end of the decade, she was making $60,000 for a day's work on a porn set, popping up in random media like Abercrombie & Fitch Quarterly, and plotting to start her own production company. Of course, this was not typical. Many, if not most, porn stars were paid flat fees for appearances, up to $800 for a boy-girl scene, for instance. They had little recourse for exploitation on set, and didn't always have the safest working conditions. Small porn performers were often coerced into doing more and more extreme acts, watering down the pay scale for everyone overall, and opening up the window of what was acceptable. And on the subject of pay scale, it was common knowledge that black women were paid less and asked to do more, you know, like in any other industry. Stars like Heather Hunter, Jenny Pepper, and the retired Angel Kelly were few and far between. And in addition to being underpaid, were unable to brand themselves like Jenna Jameson or the way an OnlyFans star might today. Instead, most of the money being made in the 90s was going into the pockets of agents, managers, and other men. In 1998, Joe Francis began hawking his Girls Gone Wild videotapes in late-night infomercials, racking up $20 million in the first 2 years alone. While self-enterprising sex workers like Danny Ash were monetizing their own assets, scores of young participants, mostly white and drunk co-eds, stripped for Girls Gone Wild videos in exchange for attention, merchandise, or a small cash fee to make Joe Francis a multi-millionaire. And consent was often murky. But for now, a key takeaway is that the systemic classism, misogyny, and racism that existed in the world of sex work was the same classism, misogyny, and racism that existed outside of sex work and catalyzed women's entrance into it. A number of pro-sex and leftist feminists would publish texts this decade, including whores and other feminists. All address the good, bad, and ugly of the various occupations while also discussing the conditions that made the sexual labor necessary. Poverty. Concluded the former stripper and scholar Nikki Roberts in the seminal Whores in History in 1992. To debate the morality of prostitution is meaningless when the fundamental issue of women's poverty is not addressed. And yet, this is what has happened over the years. On the totem pole of sex work, if Playboy posing actresses like Pam Anderson and Anna Nicole Smith were at the top, streetwalkers or full-service survival sex workers were at the bottom and most in need of financial relief. In January 1991, 35-year-old Aileen Wuornos, a near-lifelong sex worker, was arrested at the Last Resort biker bar in Port Orange, Florida, after being linked to the murders of 7 men since 1989. Wuornos claimed that each of the men had attempted to rape her. Aileen, the daughter of a schizophrenic pedophile whom she never met, was abused by her grandfather and numerous others in her childhood. When kicked out of the house at age 15, she prostituted herself to survive. By the time she was arrested at 35, she had committed various robberies, attempted to end her life several times, and fell in love with a woman named Tyria Moore, who later helped the police secure a confession from Aileen. Reported Mike Clary for the LA Times, Moore described how police put her up in a Daytona Beach motel room for 4 days and kept her supplied with plenty of Budweiser and hamburgers as they tape recorded 10 telephone conversations between the former lovers. The first major female serial killer caused a stir, in part because there was no psychological profile for a female serial killer, and Aileen's occupation and sexuality were prime media fodder. This was helped by the fact that Wuornos was adopted by a 44-year-old horse breeder named Arlene Prowl. Wrote Clary, "If this sounds like the stuff of Hollywood, it is. Wuornos and her story have set off a frenzy among filmmakers, writers, television tabloid shows, and assorted hucksters, all trying to cash in on what is perhaps an unprecedented saga of a highway femme fatale. In fact, the scramble for the rights to the Lee Wuornos story has become a story in itself." Meanwhile, feminists plumb the issue. Said Phyllis Chesler, a second-wave feminist who organized expert witness testimony about the hardships of survival sex work for Wuornos. "We may be fascinated with her because something is going on with women. Thelma and Louise, Anita Hill. Women don't want sexual harassment. Wuornos is not leading a feminist liberation army, but I can understand her actions most deeply in feminist and political terms. What would it mean if women started to defend themselves?" Evidence that Wuornos' first victim, Richard Charles Mallory, was previously convicted for attempted rape was suppressed at trial, along with the witnesses organized by Phyllis Chesler. Meanwhile, Wuornos' own story was ever-changing. In March 1992, she said, "I wanted to confess to you that Richard Mallory did violent rape me, as I've told you, but these others did not. They only began to start to." Her 1996 appeal to the Supreme Court to vacate the death sentences she was served with were rejected. Later in 2001, she'd say, "I killed those men, robbed them as cold as ice, and I'd do it again, too. There's no chance in keeping me alive or anything, because I'd kill again." When she thought the cameras were off during a documentary filming, she said the murders were self-defense, but she was just ready for her death sentence to be carried out. Feminists were divided on the use of violence against men, though all agreed on the need to address sexual trauma. When V, formerly known as Eve Ensler, interviewed over 200 women for her 1996 play, The Vagina Monologues, as a survivor of childhood incest and abuse, one of her primary interests was learning more about how women registered assault, rape, and incest and responded to it. While it became a smash hit, fringe players had already been examining sexual violence against women through music. In Washington, D.C. and the Pacific Northwest, but specifically Olympia, Washington, an amalgamation of female-led art, music, and spaces in the 1980s begat bands, zines, and activism that prioritized a critique of sexual abuse, violence, and misogyny. While leading bands like Bikini Kill, Heavens to Betsy, and Bratmobile sang about usually taboo topics like incest and rape, independent groups and women published zines to circulate new feminist theories and news. Many were also involved with domestic violence shelters and rape survivor groups. The main theme was getting girls and young women involved, especially in the male-dominated music scene. Both strains of the early Riot Grrl movement in the Pacific Northwest and D.C. had formed in response to sexism and rape culture within the punk, grunge, and alternative communities. Wrote Toby Vale, a drummer and one of the founding members of Bikini Kill, "I feel completely left out of the realm of everything that is so important to me, and I know that this is partly because punk rock is for and by boys, mostly and partly because punk rock of this generation is coming of age in a time of mindless career bands." In the second Bikini Kill zine was the Riot Grrl Manifesto, explaining, "We are angry at a society that tells us girl equals dumb, girl equals bad, girl equals weak." Bikini Kill frontwoman Kathleen Hanna was known for kicking male hecklers out of shows. Riot Grrls held their first convention in D.C. in 1991, which brought them greater attention. Reported Newsweek, "Girls marked their bodies with blunt, 5-inch high letters reading rape or slut, an MTV-era way of saying, that's what you think of me, confront your own bigotry." Wrote Camille Paglia, "It's like Madonna. She dresses like a whore, but she always knows what she wants. These girls are dressed to kill, but ready to fight." Riot Grrls were anti-rape culture and pro-sex, putting them at odds with traditional feminists, radical feminists, and non-feminists alike. Read a typical refrain by 16-year-old Jessica Hopper, a future music critic who published her own zine. "Sex isn't dirty, and it isn't bad unless someone is forcing it on you." After bad press, the main participants of the Riot Grrl movement refused to do interviews in a media blackout, believing their comments would be misconstrued and their stories falsified. For instance, Andrea Juno noted how Bikini Kill frontwoman Kathleen Hanna was devastated when the Washington Post ran a false story without her input, saying that her father raped her. So Riot Grrl media was important for getting their own stories out. Bust magazine, which began in 1993 as simply a zine, was labeled Cosmo-Feminism after the female founders intentionally set out to create a feminist publication that could compete with the main popular glossies. By the end of the decade, Bust had grown from 500 to 100,000 subscribers. Overall, the Riot Grrl culture spread nationwide and was known to the mainstream. Though it was mostly dead by 1994, there were small pop-up conventions and some meetings until 1996, as discussed in Girls to the Front by Sarah Marcus. But the movement wasn't truly dead. For instance, Bitch, Feminist Response to Pop Culture, started as a 10-page zine in 1996 before becoming the quarterly magazine Bitch. The Riot Grrl phenomena had been overwhelmingly white. Black, Latina, and Asian girls and women who published their own zines found it harder for their work to circulate, and those who performed music were largely overshadowed. When she felt ignored by Riot Grrls, musician Tamar-Kali created the short-lived Sister Girl Collective with Honeychild Coleman, Maya Glick, and Simi Stone, performing their first Riot or show on Valentine's Day 1997. This was a pillar of what would come to be known as Afropunk. Tamar-Kali, a native of Brooklyn, said on her experience in the Riot Grrl orbit, "I was aligned philosophically in terms of understanding, but I still felt on the out because it was a white-dominated scene. Being in this urban jungle, I was a different type of girl. I was hearing what they were saying, but I was living in an environment where people were getting stabbed." Riot Grrl felt like a bubblegum expression. Feeling left out of mainstream feminism and issues wasn't new, but we'll be back to black women in a moment. The values and priorities of women and feminists continued to stratify. In 1990, Camille Paglia examined sex, art and history, and sexual personae, reorienting feminist ideology around the idea that men are the weaker sex for not being able to resist the female body. As a result, she was pro-sex work, pro-gay, pro-porn, pro-choice, but as demonstrated by her earlier comment about dumb victims and rape, was not aligned with all mainstream feminist causes. The 1990 book The Beauty Myth by Naomi Wolf dove into the pressure to fit into beauty standards due to mass media, by way of popular culture, pornography, and the fashion industry. Among several topics, Wolf paid special attention to plastic surgery and eating disorders, the latter of which she exaggerated. She mistakenly reported over 150,000 women were dying a year from anorexia, which was actually the number of women who suffered from the illness, not fatalities. Still, eating disorders were a real threat, and the Kinsey Institute found in 1997 that American women had the most negative body image of any of the cultures studied. The weight loss industry was worth over $51 billion at the time. Leading women's magazines contributed to this, with a 1994 profile of popular New Glossy Allure reading, "Over a year ago, Allure ran a story arguing that society still thinks it's acceptable to discriminate against fat people. 6 months later, it was followed with a story by Faye Weldon stating that it was better to be thin and receive all the good things and privileges according to the svelte." Since the toasting of the Body Mass Index Guide in 1995 by the World Health Organization, the desire to be thin was even more potent than ever before. Achieving conventional beauty standards via plastic surgery was also in, with 89% of cosmetic surgeries being done on women by 1999, out of a total 4.6 million that year alone. The beauty myth was well received, but Wolf in her book would be a main target of Christina Hoff Sommers in her 1994 book, Who Stole Feminism? How Women Have Betrayed America. In addition to highlighting flawed and/or misleading gender studies facts, Hoff rebuffed Wolf's alleged gender/victim feminism in favor of what she called equity feminism. And she wasn't the only one. Wrote Kathy Young in 1992, Thelma and Louise, Anita Hill, The Palm Beach Trial, Naomi Wolf's The Beauty Myth, Susan Faludi's best-selling Backlash have something in common besides being about women, sex, and gender. At their center is the image of women as victims. Victims of men or victims of a male societal conspiracy. While Young conceded that anti-feminists were resorting to turning women into victims of abortion, she argued that turning women into victims was utilized by both sides. In 1991, Susan Faludi published the bestseller, Backlash, The Undeclared War Against American Women, documenting the myriad of ways that misogyny had prevailed in the 1980s, despite various victories of the second wave of feminism. She wrote in the book's epilogue, "The Backlash decade produced one long, painful, and unremitting campaign to thwart women's progress. Feminism had to adapt in a period of female serial killers and enterprising porn stars." In 1992, Rebecca Walker, the daughter of the first legal interracial marriage in Mississippi between author Alice Walker and Melvin Leventhal, published Becoming the Third Wave in Miss Magazine. The triggering event? Bearing witness to a vulgar conversation on a Manhattan subway train in the wake of Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. She wrote, "After battling with ideas of separatism and militancy, I connect with my own feelings of powerlessness. I realize that I must undergo a transformation if I am truly committed to women's empowerment. My involvement must reach beyond my own voice and discussion, beyond voting, beyond reading feminist theory. My anger and awareness must translate into tangible action. Turn that outrage into political power. Do not vote for them unless they work for us. Do not have sex with them. Do not break bread with them. Do not nurture them if they don't prioritize our freedom to control our bodies and our lives. I am not a post-feminism feminist. I am the third wave." Third wave priorities varied. In addition to a general reclamation of the word bitch, intimate partner violence, sexual freedom, reproductive rights, and misogyny were key issues for many women. After the Riot Grrls, Alanis Morissette stormed onto the scene with her third studio album, Jagged Little Pill, in 1995, which begat the angry and raw hit You Oughta Know, which went platinum in my mama's house. In 1997, there was Criminal by Fiona Apple and Bitch by Meredith Brooks. Sang Brooks, I'm a bitch, I'm a lover, I'm a child, I'm a mother, I'm a sinner, I'm a saint, I do not feel ashamed. Apple, Morissette, and Brooks were all signed to major labels, unlike the Riot Grrls, who had made angry female punk rock more palatable. As detailed by Christian Schilt in A Little Too Ironic, the appropriation and packaging of Riot Grrl politics, Morissette and Apple focused their anger on many of the same issues as Riot Grrl. However, they were carefully constructed as non-threatening, and their form of female empowerment was something to buy in CD format, rather than something to actively produce. In interviews, they were well-behaved and polite. And, unlike Kathleen Hanna, they did not talk about feminism or the oppression of women. The commodification of women's empowerment in music would continue. Enter the Spice Girls in 1996, whose girl power themes were both groundbreaking and marketable. While the angry rock girls like Alanis Morissette, Fiona Apple, and Meredith Brooks were already palatable, the Wannabe and Say You'll Be There singers were so globally consumable that they had made nearly $1 billion from hundreds of products and 2 albums by 1998. The Spice Girls told The Guardian, "We're freshening up feminism for the 90s. Feminism has become a dirty word. Girl power is just a 90s way of saying it." The Spice Girls were 5 individuals, sporty, innocent, sexy, wild, snobby, who had their choice in outfits, relationships, and their careers. They told their fans the future is female and chose to promote female friendships. 2 were conservative, 1 was politically apathetic, 1 was pro-labor, and 1 was a fake anarchist. Predictably, their shallow corporate feminism was heavily criticized, which you can learn more about in this deep cut on my Patreon. Is feminism dead? Asked Gina Belafonte for Time magazine in 1998, with a picture of Ally McBeal next to Susan B. Anthony, Betty Friedan, and Gloria Steinem. In the popular WB show starring Callista Flockhart as a Boston lawyer, the character was criticized for emotional instability and miniskirts. The absurdist humor, including the eventually viral dancing baby that mocked Ally as she considered her biological clock, turned some people off. The show's plot lines were primarily about romance over legal drama, further generating complaints that the show was vapid. However, it courted 11 to 14 million viewers during its first 3 seasons. Said a real lawyer who was noted to wear short skirts to court, "It's time for women to be able to be feminine and aggressive and successful at what they do. It's important to crash that stereotype that all women do is get married and have kids." Ally's single, supporting herself, making her own decisions, asking, "Should I be looking to get married? Do I want to or don't I want to have children?" A show that received more feminist praise was Buffy the Vampire Slayer, starring Sarah Michelle Gellar. Not only did it create a mega fandom and an umbrella of studies focusing on the show's sociological, psychological, and feminist implications, but it garnered millions of viewers because of Joss Whedon's desire to represent high school as a horror movie. By the way, this is a Xander hate account. If you know, you know. The show influenced the creation of more female-led supernatural shows and showcased one of the first normal lesbian relationships on TV. However, a bunch of discourse happened when Buffy lost her virginity. Her choice to have sex literally turned a guy evil. Choice and sexuality were crucial components of third-wave feminism, which was increasingly promoted as something that varied by woman. Several second-wave feminists weren't pleased. "All that sex stuff is stupid. The real problems have to do with women's lives and how you put together work and family," said Betty Friedan in 1998, the same year that Yale announced it was renaming its Women's Studies department to Women and Gender Studies. Older second-wave feminists like Betty Friedan had long since become disconnected from the radical feminists of the 80s, and the emerging third wave of the early 90s was no different, especially because feminists were not and had never been a monolith. The third wave was made up of several forms of feminism. While sex workers looked at the internet as a lucrative vehicle, female philosophers, coders, and artists of the early 90s were developing cyber-feminism, which theorized that the internet and technology would free everyone from the social constructs of race, gender, and sexual labels. The theories were built on Donna Haraway's 1986 essay, A Cyborg Manifesto, which was updated and republished in 1991. There was also ecofeminism, transfeminism, and anarchy feminism. Even more so than white women, whose conditions had been altered by 1970s feminism, black women in the 90s were coming out of decades of inequity and poor access to resources. They were different from their mothers and grandmothers, yet still not far away from internalized misogyny or the need to demonstrate oneself as a strong black woman. As showcased in the Clarence Thomas, R. Kelly, and OJ debacles we discussed in the 3rd episode, Black women continued to prioritize race over gender, often to maintain their careers and livelihoods, but also to protect fathers, brothers, lovers, and sons. Furthermore, regardless of if a Black woman was one of the many who attended college in large numbers, got hired in new positions of power, started new businesses, or took advantage of new modes of sex work, she still needed to walk a tightrope between two worlds of racism and misogyny. In 1990, Patricia Hill Collins published Black Feminist Thought, a watershed of Black feminist theory that contextualized and included working-class Black women's experiences. She identified a matrix of domination and intersecting oppressions, as well as the controlling images or stereotypes in media that normalize and encourage the oppression of Black women. Additionally, she proved in an academic fashion that a specific Black feminist framework was significant, building on legal scholar Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw's coining of intersectionality in 1989. 8 years later, Killing the Black Body by Dorothy Roberts, which detailed systemic reproductive violence against Black women and control and exploitation of their wombs, reinforced both Collins and Crenshaw's assertion that a Black feminist framework was crucial. A supreme example of where it could be applied was in hip-hop. As hip-hop took over the country and spat out new leaders and icons who would influence society for decades to come, Black women's participation and representation in hip-hop culture was of substantial debate. Just like hip-hop itself. Black feminists like Trisha Rose, Bell Hooks, and Michelle Wallace were key critics of the genre, which, to be clear, had plenty of supporters. Said Congresswoman Maxine Waters, whose district included hip-hop mecca South Central Los Angeles, it would be a foolhardy mistake to single out poets as the cause of America's problems. These are our children, and they've invented a new form to describe their pains, fears, and frustrations with us as adults. Just because we don't like the symbols they use or the way they look, we should not allow that to cause us to embark on a course of censorship. This was in direct conflict with hip-hop's #1 enemy, C. Dolores Tucker. She was a Philadelphia native who had been active in some form of politics since the 60s civil rights movement. The woman who would be assailed in numerous songs and interviews by hip-hop's biggest performers had declared a war on gangsta and porno rap by 1993. In 1994, she protested the NAACP for giving Tupac an Image Award. She wrote a 1995 piece with anti-violence content crusader William Bennett entitled Lyrics from the Gutter, and they launched the initiative Empower America. While she was a Democrat and not a feminist, and he was a Republican and also not a feminist, they had a shared concern that Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, 9 Inch Nails, and Tupac Shakur would have an impact on children and women, like Trisha Rose and Michelle Wallace. In 1996, at the age of 67, Tucker became the target of a smear campaign by Death Row Records and Suge Knight, the same year that Death Row artist Snoop Dogg was on trial for murder and Tupac was actually murdered. C. Dolores Tucker was accused of being anti-Semitic, and the conversation turned to her credentials and past allegations of misusing state funds in the 70s, rather than concentrating on the continued violence and misogyny in hip-hop. In 1997, she unsuccessfully sued Tupac Shakur's estate for causing emotional distress by name-dropping her in 2 songs. At the end of one, Wonder Why They Call You Bitch, which harped on gold diggers, sex workers, and the promiscuous, Tupac addressed her directly, saying, "I figured you wanted to know, why we call them hoes bitches. And maybe this might help you understand. It ain't personal. Strictly business, baby. Strictly business." The average Black woman, whose history of rape and fetishization during and after slavery made her prone to being the target of people's assumptions. And this made her concerned with not being lumped into the bitches and hoe category Tupac identified. Though most rejected the feminist label, many did have a discomfort with the misogyny in hip-hop. In 1999's When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, author Joan Morgan coined the term hip-hop feminism, and she considered Black women's historical and contemporary lack of interest in identifying as feminists. Like the Black Riot Grrls, various feminist groups felt unappealing and exclusionary or even downright white supremacist in nature. Morgan described her late 80s experience at a New England college with feminists that came in 2 flavors, both variations of vanilla. She wrote, "The most visible were the braless, butch-cut anti-babes who seemed to think the solution to sexism was reviling all things male, except oddly enough their clothing and mannerisms, and sleeping with each other. The others, straight and more femme, were all for the liberation of women as long as it did not infringe on their sense of entitlement. They felt their men should share the power to oppress. They were the spiritual descendants of the early suffragettes and absolutely not to be trusted." She then broke down why black women of the 90s, shrouded in stereotypes, hip-hop's misogyny, and racism, needed their own feminism. She met 90s black women where they were instead of proposing radicalism. Detailing the struggles of surviving and dating while being the strong black woman that society and the community demanded, and grappling with the rise of misogyny in the genre she grew up revering, Morgan also came to terms with her envy of the chicken head, or gold diggers, groupies, and sidekicks to the powerful men in Morgan's orbit, the kind of women who were central antagonists in the writings of Sister Souljah in another 1999 book, The Coldest Winter Ever. Wrote Morgan, "I confess, I'm a longtime chicken hater. One of those smart, successful, hardworking, educated, super independent black girls who spends a lot of time dissing your abject materialism, your predilection for Ricky Lake skankwear, and the nauseating way you stroke the male ego. But," she concluded, "we all want the same thing. Someone to love us, to shower us with attention, nurture and provide for us and our kids. The hatred we have for your chicken-headed asses is in part the mask of bravado we wear to camouflage our fears." With this passage, Morgan recognized the non-existent line she believed to be protecting her from misogyny and preventing her from loneliness. But would all black women? Outside of these various feminist concentrations, the majority of women were living their lives and surviving, reacting to the world around them, and were not explicitly feminists. Their choices and livelihoods were always connected to the movement, and they always have everything to gain and lose. But for many, at most, they'd embrace girl power, a fat-free version of feminism, or nothing at all. Despite ongoing rape culture, systemic flaws, and inequities, a crop of party women, painted both as heroes and villains, rose to the forefront of political media and policy. Janet Reno was unmarried and childless when selected for the Attorney General's position in 1993, and had a reputation for being tough on child abusers especially. Her swift apprehension of the World Trade Center attackers were toasted, but her actions involving David Koresh and Waco, which we come back to in the next episode, put her under intense scrutiny before she apologized and received positive press for a short time. She also continued to serve in her position after a Parkinson's diagnosis in 1996. She gave permission to Kenneth Starr to expand his investigation into Clinton in 1998, shortly before the Lewinsky affair went public. Reno was frequently called masculine and made fun of, like being spoofed by Will Ferrell on SNL. While celebrated as heroines of the new dawn of women's advancements and rights, being first in a national position of power didn't halt the empire. Madeline Albright, a divorced mother and ambassador to the UN, was selected as the first female Secretary of State in 1997, and she had a significant impact on foreign policy that we discussed in the last episode of this series. But for now, let's turn our attention to Hillary Clinton, who, as we discussed back in episode 2, had a poor reputation after the failed healthcare plan. Hillary had a public approval rating of 31% by August 1995, making her the most unpopular First Lady in modern history. And much of this was because of her ambition. She was no more corrupt or colonizing than her male peers, but she was more hated. Numerous quotes from the period call her all types of bitches. Said a 43-year-old in 1996, "The guys at work call her," no, I don't want to say that. I don't know why, but they just don't like her. By this time, Hillary stopped attending strategy sessions and no longer sat next to Bill in meetings. She became the most traveled First Lady, visiting 79 countries during her tenure, including a 1995 tour of the Asian continent. She championed women's rights as inextricable from human rights, including at the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. She listed abuses against women that were happening in China without addressing China by name, and this was considered to be a bold move. The speech was groundbreaking for the time and gave Hillary some good press. On my birthday in 1996, child, I don't know why so many Clinton happenings were on January 26, my day, Hillary was the first lady to be subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury regarding the Whitewater scandal. Later that year, she published the best-selling It Takes a Village and Other Lessons Children Teach Us, emphasizing extended families and affordable daycare during a period when people were criticizing single mothers and divorce. Mocked Bob Dole at that year's Republican National Convention. After the virtual devastation of the American family, the rock upon which this country was founded, we are told that it takes a village that is collective, and thus the state, to raise a child. The state is now more involved than it ever has been in the raising of children, and children are now more neglected, more abused, and more mistreated than they have been in our time. I'm here to tell you it does not take a village to raise a child. It takes a family to raise a child. Observers noted this was a mistake on Dole's part, with one columnist remarking, "He can only look like a bully in the end," while hoping to unite welfare reform dissenters in the Democratic Party behind the president's more outwardly liberal wife. Public opinion on Hillary would be reshaped in the aftermath of the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and in the late 90s, as we'll learn, she'd speak out against treatment of Afghani women under the Taliban, and began eyeing a seat in the U.S. Senate. On the opposite side of neoliberal women were a new brand of conservative women who wouldn't have fit in with Little Miss Phyllis Schlafly 20 years previously, even if they shared similar ideas. "It's the white Anglo-Saxon male that's endangered today," declared Helen Chenoweth, the first and only Republican woman to represent Idaho in Congress and the second woman overall. This conservative girl boss and divorcee once worked on Barry Goldwater's 1964 campaign and served as an executive director of the Idaho Republican Party before becoming a lobbyist. In 1990, she started the Idaho Family Forum, largely made up of women who distributed over 300,000 voting guides, demonstrating the unique dimensions of conservative women's power that we've been tracking since the 1970s. She mobilized, enticed, and empowered a network of female loggers, gun owners, ranchers, and business owners who would never in their life identify with the term feminism, whether you categorized it as equity, victim, or third wave. Chenoweth, who served 3 terms, defied expectations of traditional Republicans by being a single working mother, kind of like Dan Quayle's fictional nemesis Murphy Brown. Chenoweth's election in 1994 came during the Republican Revolution and in the aftermath of Waco and Ruby Ridge, the latter of which was in Idaho. As you might recall from our exploration of the 1980s, Chenoweth's state was one of the proposed utopias for white supremacists and extremists, so it makes perfect sense that she would be a champion of school prayer, militias, and conspiracy theories, all topics that get a deep dive in the next episode of this series, along with news media. Speaking of the media, let's turn our attention to the phenomenon of what historian Nicole Hemmer called the pundits. These women offered a glossy and sexy new angle to a conservatism that was part Phyllis Schlafly and part Rush Limbaugh. Like Chenoweth, they were starkly different from Schlafly, who, yes, had worked outside the home and amassed power through her own initiatives and media channels, but was a wife and grandmother, born in the 20s. The conservatives of the 90s were being invaded by highly educated women who wore less than modest clothing, dated multiple men, didn't have children, had gay friends, and other things that would have been taboo for a conservative woman trying to be taken seriously just 10 or 20 years previously. While not blonde and therefore susceptible to being overshadowed by her fellows, in 1998, Amy Holmes, a policy analyst for the anti-feminist Independent Women's Forum, said to Harper's Bazaar, "They assume that conservative women are blue-haired ladies who want to slap chastity belts on young women, and that young conservative women are precious white Southerners with careful bobs, little red fingernails, careful little jackets, careful little skirts. Well, I'm not some Southern belle, and I'm certainly not white, but I'm definitely conservative. Conservatism is the liberating philosophy, the philosophy of the 90s. Liberalism is passé." Added Camille Paglia, "The arrival of the chic, conservative female Power Rangers on the scene in the 90s has totally blown apart the stranglehold that the feminist establishment once had on women's issues." Ann Coulter was a corporate lawyer who briefly worked in the Senate Judiciary Committee after 1994's Republican Revolution, with the intention to help repeal the New Deal. She worked pro bono on Paula Jones's case against Bill Clinton, and in 1996 she was invited onto MSNBC. the newbie brainchild of Microsoft and General Electric. The channel had less than 24,000 viewers compared to CNN's average 578,000, but it was more comparable to Fox News, who averaged 30,000 viewers. Coulter was featured prominently in the early days, while regularly being fired, until she eventually went too far, saying something too controversial and being permanently let go. But she was already building momentum as a right-wing darling. In 1998, Coulter published High Crimes and Misdemeanors, making the case for the impeachment of Clinton. Similarly, Laura Ingraham, a lawyer who had been a speechwriter in the Reagan administration and clerked under Clarence Thomas, would pass MSNBC screen tests to deliver news that was watered down with inflammatory opinions and embodying anti-feminism and anti-affirmative action. She wrote for The Times, "The idea that women are constantly thwarted by invisible barriers of sexism relegates them to permanent victim status. It also stands on its head the cause that true feminists originally championed, equal opportunity for all." After a splashy profile in New York Times style in 1995 and one too many bigoted remarks, she was fired from MSNBC in 1996, but her television career was just picking up. Barbara Olson was another blonde and blue-eyed conservative lawyer who was a regular on CNN and Fox, and she also wrote a takedown book on Hillary Clinton in 1999. Her career would have been much longer if she hadn't died while on the 9/11 flight from New York to Los Angeles to shoot an episode of Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher. These pundits were chasing connections and fame. Published New York Magazine in a 1998 article titled "Washington's Sexual Awakening," the romances of the new breed of GOP women can be seen as strategic alliances, increasing their name recognition and broadening their base of support. Kellyanne Fitzpatrick has been romantically linked to Senator Fred Thompson. Unsurprisingly, these women face misogyny like anybody else. In an opinion piece about Ann Coulter for Salon, a male columnist wrote, "You look like you survive on 6 pieces of sushi, no avocado, and an M&M per day," before telling her to stop being a bitch and buy a vibrator. The physical insult and sexual remark obviously rubbed some women the wrong way. Wrote one named Rebecca Wilson to Salon's editor in response, "I am deeply disturbed by the tone of that diatribe about Ann Coulter. She may be a big-time Republican talking head, but the tone of his advice to her was abusive, offensive, and just plain rude. Some man responding to a woman's opinion by attacking her clothes, demeanor, body, or sexual history. I'm truly disappointed. She may be a hardcore Republican, but so is my mother. No woman deserves to be attacked in that way, and especially not in public." In 1996, a teenager named Fawzia Kasinga fled the Tongolese Republic to America, seeking asylum because she refused to undergo female genital mutilation and be forcibly married, both accepted practices in her culture. She was granted asylum, becoming the first woman granted this protection because of gender persecution. Female genital mutilation was one of many issues being brought to wider attention beyond American borders. In Rwanda, the Congo, and other war-torn areas, women were raped, impregnated, infected, or worse. Over in the fallen Soviet Union, hundreds of thousands of women were being trafficked as corruption reigned and a strict oligarchy formed, their destinations all across the globe, including America. All of these things were happening at once, competing for public attention. As the various fractures in American feminism and women's concerns continued to harden around identities, racism, survival, and immediate localized problems, the issues of the wider world continued to be largely drowned out. But before we get back to those global issues occurring at the end of history, we have to discuss the mind, body, and soul of a country juiced with conspiracy theories, diversified media, and decades of bigotry and violence long swept under the fabric of America. A fermentation of fears, anxieties, hatred, religiosity, and mental illness will become a powder keg of activity in a decade filled with the issues we discussed in these first 5 episodes. Get ready. Next, it's time for American X. If you're enjoying this series, make sure you become a patron for early access, sources, and extra content. Check out the free companion series, I Love the 90s, featuring deep dives on 90s Christmas, Halloween, food history, true crime, and more upcoming topics. On Patreon, for $25 and up a month, you get listed in the credits of every 90s related episode and cool limited edition merchandise. For $10 and up a month, you get listed in the credits of I Love the 90s. For $5 and up a month, you get access to the exclusive companion series Deep Cuts, which focuses on regional history that will take you even further into the 90s. So far, we've talked about the UK, Texas, and Los Angeles. In the latest Deep Cut, we discuss the history of my hometown, Charlotte, North Carolina, while digging into the city that shaped me as a person and historian. In the next Deep Cut, we'll be discussing New York 90s history and representations in media. And for $3 and up a month on Patreon, you get access to the study guides and glossaries for this series. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you like and subscribe. Featuring the hit single UNITY. Oh, no. Just do the first one. FIFA, FIFA, FIFA. Child, why can I never remember if it's FIFA or FIFA? I done got dragged before for that one. I don't watch soccer.